And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's fantastic to be here. It's a great crowd tonight already, and I can already see there's some very lively conversations going on in the Ideas Room here. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And boy, there's been so much going on in the world in between now and the last broadcast. Of course, last Saturday, we were able to host Graham Hancock here in Cambridge, and we filmed that whole event, and we are going to have that available for everyone next week. This is a very powerful conversation that we had over 2 hours here in Cambridge, and Graham is bringing 100%. He's more vital than he ever has been, and I've known him for quite some time. I've never seen him so engaged and so enlivened. So that's going to be something fascinating. We did manage to get a good shot at the end of the night, which kind of captures the moment a little bit. And we're going to be telling you more about that very, very important evening with Graham Hancock doing America Before, his important, very important new book. Which plays right into exteganography, and trust me, our conversation dovetailed right into it. And one thing I want to say about the X series and the exteganography that we're covering here is that more and more as I talk to experts in various fields of archaeology or alternative research in history or on the UFO file, over and over again, now that we've brought in this kind of Rosetta Stone of the exteganography for them to view things through, it has come up over and over and over again. The footprints of this mysterious group leaving this X symbology, the steganography, right there in plain sight. And that's what we do here on the X series, is track this. Now, we certainly have seen it playing out quite a lot in the media and in pop culture, but and we're going to get to some of those examples because there's some fabulous examples for that tonight. But one of the things that's very important about tonight is what the episode is about, and it is the very crux, the very heart of what we're doing here with the X series, and that is the Hotzone. And the Hotzone is something that, and particularly we're going to be focusing through the figure of Edgar Cayce in the Hotzone. I want to point out that the Hotzone lies here between Florida, the coast of Florida, which is Bimini here on this side, and then over here we have the western tip of Cuba, where Polina Zalitsky, the oceanographer, found an underwater city. And then here we have the Yucatan Peninsula, and down here the Caribbean. This zone is cause for geopolitical concern on one hand, and also cause for a massive research projects and competition in what Joseph Farrell would call archaeology wars. I understand Joseph's in the chat. It's great to see you out there. And I just saw Gigi Young, who we're going to be quoting here very soon. It's great to have Gigi out there.
Groovy Bean is also joining us.
Groovy Bean, it's great to have you. Your series Reality Check with Jay Widener is just off the charts and getting incredible feedback on that. So everybody is rising to the challenge right now. It's a very fantastic time. I know Olivia and I were just watching that the Weasel episode.
The Way of the Weasel.
Way of the Weasel. I'm going to start off this entire episode with this idea around the Hotzone, which is that simply in the Edgar Cayce readings, he predicted that the land would rise off the east coast of America, and that this land would be connected with the ancient continent of Atlantis, and it would set off all these bells and whistles around the world as a result. Now, he predicted the first piece of it would rise in 1968, which would be the Temple of Poseidon off of Bimini Island. And in 1968, they found the Bimini Road, or the Bimini Wall, as it actually is called. And this is a long series of stretch of these stones, which many call beach rock, that are lined and constructed in a man-made fashion around the island of Bimini. And something about the change from hurricanes and everything else, we got to see this now just from 15 feet. So you're talking about 15, 20 feet of water. As a matter of fact, when Graham Hancock was here, we discussed how he had actually dived, and he went right along those stones. It wasn't very hard at all. It was right there. Very unusual guest to Bimini lately. RFK Jr. was there recently. There's a lot about Bimini that's going to be coming forward, because Bimini is going to be, according to Edgar Cayce, the first glimpse of the high civilization underwater rising. This is something that the mystery schools have hinted at, this shift where the water levels change and we're able to see more of what went down there. Because remember, in some sense, the Atlantean destruction was natural in terms of they faced natural disasters. But some of it was caused, in Cayce's words, by this two-eye stone, which is a massive power station that the Atlanteans had that drew land down artificially, the same way that it allowed things to float in the air. So we're looking at a very powerful technology. And tonight we're going to look at also a NASA engineer who had constructed the two-eye stone based on the Cayce readings, and even came up with a scale model. Let's see how that shows up. And the idea being fundamentally that these ruins constitute the first indications underwater of this high civilization rising, and that there are a number of groups that want to reach in there and have it. And so by people that I've spoken to who were under oaths when they worked on certain jobs, and some of these were non-military jobs, whenever they would get into this area, they had something where it was like an NDA, that if you got out of there, you couldn't talk about these ruins, or if you glimpsed them, you had to make a report and just give it back. And a lot of this involved mapping the ocean floor, so they just run into it by accident. And but the area has been confirmed to me by sources working in oceanography, the experts, and also these people leaking this information to me, as they call it the Hotzone. That's where the title comes from. Something in that area and those ruins constitutes something that they're not supposed to talk about when they get down there. Now, interestingly enough, Gigi, Gigi Young, who's on the show very much and very familiar to X-readers, and she has a fantastic site herself, gigiyoung.com. She put out something that I found interesting, and I'm going to quote it here, which is, she said, there will be a false rising of Atlantis, artifacts found and things found. The entire narrative of the situation will encapsulate the lies of this era, political, social, and spiritual. It's a move to secure deep control through the perversion of spiritual memory. This is quite interesting. You know, just as we're seeing the kind of false disclosure, and Olivia, we were talking about this earlier with Elizondo on Good Morning America and all this, you know, and all of these reports getting flooded, you know, just in time for the show that launches tonight, Unidentified. And we've certainly done a lot of coverage on Elizondo and his CIA version of disclosure, with Tom DeLonge being roped in and used by these people. And everywhere you look in that group at the top levels, it's all CIA agents. And, you know, some of the people have come back to me and said, well, it's not all CIA agents. Well, it's about 88% CIA agents. And then the rest, everything else that's left, are either Lockheed Martin or Boeing military contractors. So certainly not the kind of group you're going to get anything close to the truth from. And we've talked extensively about the reinvention of the UFO file. That is, oh, suddenly this grainy footage that comes out in 2017 constitutes UFOs. And by the way, we're going to call them something else now. We're going to call them UAP. Well, no, they're called UFOs, and the study of them has gone back over 70 years. And in fact, the CIA has tried to pervert that study for the public. So let's really get real about that. I was able to watch this first episode of Unidentified before it was live, because they leaked it to a select number of journalists that they thought, and I wasn't one of them, but I happen to know one of them. And so I got an early, thank you, Lou, and thank you, Tom. I got an early version of your show. And all I can say is it was very narrative heavy, and there was a lot of portraying you know, Elizondo. I thought they were going to burn the camera with his eyes, you know, with these close-ups where, oh, he's such intensely looking for the UFO file. We have to remember that Elizondo, anything else that people may try to portray him as, is a CIA counterintelligence officer with decades of experience. And counterintelligence means You're good at lying. So that's the first place that we take off. The second place is the vice president of the organization is Jim Semivan, who has over 3 decades at the highest level of covert operations to the CIA. This is not the kind of group you would trust with the UFO file. So it was quite amazing. And so their show is going live tonight. And but this is the kind of thing, the false UFO disclosure from the CIA side. And I thought it was quite fascinating, Gigi suggesting in public here on Twitter that there's going to be a version of this for Atlantis. I think that that is something to keep an eye out for and makes a lot of sense. But let's talk about how this idea of Bimini came up in the first place, because, of course, we've done episodes tying in the fact that Ernest Hemingway and his brother Les were in Bimini, and that they were getting readings from Edgar Cayce. And they're also spending a long time between Bimini and Cuba. And those ties between the Cayce family and the Hemingway family are deep, deep, deep in the subject matter for the Hotzone. And I've done a series of episodes on that I recommend. But tonight we're going to go further. We're going to bring in the Dodge family, which, of course, is famous for Dodge cars. And we're one of the first real billionaire families in America. And the Dodges are, yes, Olivia, you got something?
Sorry.
You got
Gigi's so funny. She said, it's a strange time to be alive when a middle-aged CIA official wears a backwards baseball cap and calls himself Lou.
Lou.
And she was spelling Lou, L-O-U, and I corrected her. It's
It's L-U-E, yes. We know the handbags are coming out next. Lou. The new fragrance by TSA. It's coming. Yes, there's a lot to laugh at there. It is.
By the way, Scruples said I'm not allowed to squeeze the blue chicken anymore, and I had to prove the point that I can. So at some point in the evening, I have to get the blue chicken and be able to squeeze it.
It may not happen tonight, but it's definitely going to happen in June sometime.
It's always close by.
Yes. Olivia, you are the queen of the novelty item.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at the Dodge family and the Dodge brothers, John and Horace, let's think about this. Why on earth would the Dodges be involved with Bimini? What was Cayce suggesting? Well, he's giving a series of readings to this very mysterious business group that comes to him in 1926 and 27 and asks for readings pertaining to Bimini, suggesting that they want to find oil there. And he instantly comes back and says, it's predominantly coral. You're not going to find any oil. You're not going to find any oil there. But he does suggest that you can find things like gold there. But it seems to me the questions are very leading in that they know of his Atlantis readings and are trying to get this information out of him about treasure on Bimini. And what happens is he starts to talk about the Poseidian Temple that surrounds Bimini and that is there in the water and is rising. And then when they ask for who should take on the project, he directs them to the Dodge family, saying that they're already well established in working in Bimini. Now that's a really big clue from the Cayce readings. And on a more kind of cosmological note, he says, well, the Dodges once ruled here in Poseidia. So that is quite interesting. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Gaia Sophia just said the Dodge mansion was for sale cheap in Detroit.
Wow, isn't that
Wouldn't
fascinating?
that be interesting?
Well, they have been gone for a long time, and Chrysler took over the majority of their operations. So yes, as a family, they certainly were one of the kind of huge baron families from the turn of the last century. Let's take a quick look at them and some of the unusual backgrounds that give us a real glimpse of who they are and how they relate to Cayce's work in the Hotzone. And then we're going to talk about how this group took Cayce to Bimini and put him in the heart of the Hotzone in order to get these specific readings regarding this Poseidian Temple and Hall of Records that comes from this Atlantean culture, and the kind of advanced technology that he was suggesting was a part of that. And which in those Hall of Records, as we've seen in Egypt, there's always been a huge kerfuffle over. There's always been this diving to get what Cayce said was under the Sphinx. But Cayce actually said the records were placed in 3 different places, that they were placed in Egypt under the Sphinx, that they were placed in this Poseidian Temple off Bimini, and that they were placed in Yucatan. So all 3 locations, the 3 records are one. And this is a set, really a large-scale set of information relating to the technology of the period and the kind of spiritual interface of the Two-Eye Stone with humanity. Very, very unusual. Let's take a quick look at these brothers, both redheads. And the Dodge brothers, John and Horace, had a reputation for being very independent, somewhat private, and at a certain point, they would rise in the ranks there in Michigan, especially in Detroit, during the heady days of working with Henry Ford, who they later surpassed. As you can see back here, something very interesting is happening with this logo. And if those of you who watched the X-Steganography show will recognize that that is, in fact, the Theosophical Society logo behind them. That's the logo that they adopted for their company, and we're going to find out why as we go along in tonight's episode. One thing, just for a quick comparison to keep us on the same page, this is the Theosophical Society logo, and it's more kind of bare essentials. And at the top, we have this kind of topsy-turvy X, which, as we know, the swastika originally appeared there, and then it was this, and then a real tightened-up X, but that's the original there. A lot of interesting things pertaining to the esoteric background of the Dodges and the strange connection that they will have with the X technology going forward, and how whenever Bimini comes up, Cayce's right there with the Dodges over and over again. So we're going to take a quick look at what was driving the Dodges on this front. Just a couple of quick things to give us a snapshot of the era. Here are the Dodges kicking around in a Dodge. Back here in about 1916. Now, these were very close brothers. They weren't twins, but they operated in such a fashion that people felt like they were twins. And they had this kind of psychic connection with each other. Interestingly enough, they would both die in the same year, 1920, and under kind of unusual circumstances. And one being 52 and the other 48, relatively young for this. Now, here again, we're seeing this logo, and what's interesting is it's showing up a little light here, but here's the same Theosophical logo, which is basically here a Star of David with the world inside of it. And this is their first car that they built for the Army in that period during World War I, giving us a real snapshot of some of their influences. We're going to be very picture-heavy tonight because so much of the story is explosive and explodes off the page, but it explodes in pictures, and that's something I want us to keep in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're in episode 55 of the X-Steganography series, and tonight's episode is very special because it brings us Edgar Cayce in the Hotzone. And really, Edgar Cayce gave us the most definitive legacy of Atlantis. You know, when we look at the Theosophical Society, when we look at anthroposophy, we have incredible legacies of this mystery school coming forward. But there's not such detail as you will find in the Edgar Cayce readings. The Edgar Cayce readings give us the fact that they had television, that they could see through mountains, that they could travel through objects with their technology, with their ships, that they could travel underwater, that they could travel beyond the Earth. These are all things that are in the heart of the Cayce readings, which were taking place in 1920. There was no way for him to know of the incredible things that were coming in the way of lasers and physics and atomic energy. So it's quite remarkable when we bring it to this level. I do want to remind everyone to sign up for the Dark Journalist newsletter, by the way, because of the important things we have coming up. And go to darkjournalist.com. That's a free newsletter that will give you just a heads up on the events we have coming up, like we just had with Graham Hancock, and we were able to offer the tickets to our subscribers first. That's the kind of benefit that you get from being a subscriber. But also, just to let you know that the Friday shows, as they are, it'll give you the guests and the heads up. And we know with the way that the social media networks have been and how they're just throwing everyone off left and right, that's our real pipeline to stay in touch on this work, which is really just too important. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, Joseph Farrell wants to know when you're going to write that damn book.
Well, you know, Joseph, you're a great inspiration because you have that ability to really kind of
well, write a book in a month if necessary.
crank out the material. Very prolific and powerful work. So if you say it's a go, then I know I have to do it. Let's take a quick look at the Theosophical logo, and we're going to find a very interesting crossover in the crest of the Dodges, which is going to give us this lock again between Theosophy and the Dodges. And then the Rosicrucians, another mystery school, are going to show up here. Here, we've got one of the early Theosophical Society logos. And you notice that eye in the middle, which just has that kind of all-seeing eye aspect. Very interesting indeed. They dropped this eventually, but I want to show you where it does show up. When we look, and I spent a lot of time looking into the Dodges and their background, all the way back to the original Dodges in the UK and in Germany. And so I'm going to whip through these quickly.
Give me a warning when you're going to show the picture.
Of which one?
You know exactly.
Oh, yeah. If I still have it, we will. So you'll notice on Dodge's cars, this very interesting crest is showing up in the early versions. And we're going to get a close-up look at this, but I wanted to show in relation to the car where they would put this. Again, this is the close-up of their logo, clearly the Theosophical logo with the Star David. And over here, some unusual things that I'll mention when we look at where the Hotzone is and what they're showing here. Both sides. We've got Africa over here and the Gulf of Mexico over here. Their crest, though, is even more compelling in a sense. I'm going to show you why in a minute. Interestingly enough, as in the Theosophical Society eye here we have that eye right in the middle, and here it's crying these tears on their crest. And this is the Dodge crest from the UK, and the rest of it is kind of general accoutrement of the period, but this I find particularly interesting. It's going to come up quite powerfully here.
Right,
shortly.
we've seen the single eye, right, many times, but not a crying eye.
A crying eye. Now this makes it a little bit different. Again, this is the Ireland version, and again we have the Dodge eye. Keeping in mind that we're focusing on the Dodge family because Cayce is referencing them over and over again when it comes to Bimini and the Poseidian Temple that is on the rise there, and it's something that's rising here in the 21st century. And by the way, we're going to find some very interesting people who bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean in order to capture this when it came up. And this is another one of those kind of secrets that have been held in denial, but the mystery schools have brought information forward about it, so we're looking at it. And again, some oddness here when we're looking at the Dodge logo, and we find this strange in the Hotzone here, everything connected. No, not showing those disconnections so well. I find that very interesting, but we're going to move on because we have a lot to look at.
Gigi just mentioned, are the tears bees? It looks like bee striping. It's an interesting
very
point.
interesting, yeah. Well, bees definitely were connected so much with ancient Egypt, and but they do look like that. I'm going to whip through some more of their crests. Now, this is something interesting that happens in the crests. Once in a while, there's something that's called an aquatic dog. It's blue in color and has webbed hands and kind of a scaly back. And it shows up over and over again. Let's see if we can, I'm going to get a little bit more of a close-up, but there he is, just so you know that he's up there. And sometimes he shows up at the top. A lot of this imagery and the steganography that accompanies it, I think, are giving us hints about who they are and what their purpose is, in a sense. And I think that there comes a point when looking at this where we start to get a handle on the idea that the Dodges are a deep, deep esoteric tradition. and their family, and that they are very much involved in the X technology and bringing it out. And we're going to find that groups that were working with them and were probably in opposition to them seemed to thrive after they died. And they even formed something called the Millionaires Club. And this is something that also happens in Michigan. So Michigan is a real hotbed around this period of, say, World War I for both esoteric groups coming together, these elite groups shaking hands, and this technology coming forward. And again, it's all in the how does the technology come out? When we flash forward a century later, we're looking at 2020 coming up next year. And again, we have hidden forces that have been cultivating technology in the UFO file, debating with each other, the Jeff Bezos type, is it Blue Origin? How do we get this stuff out to the public? Well, let's roll out some false UFO ops and try to scare everybody. This should be a good way to do it. And of course, UFOs are very real, but the appropriation of them, the UAP, the Tom DeLonge, Hillary Clinton operation, John Podesta involved with that. That's a very, very dicey version of it. And of course, Trump has the Space Force. So we're right in the middle of this again. If we can get a snapshot of what the Dodges were dealing with and how that related to this Atlantis rising theme, and then go directly to the Cayce readings, speaking about this and bringing out, in a different way. I have to say this about Edgar Cayce, which is the work is so powerful that I think when we look at how it's been handled by the culture at large, it's not always a pretty picture. We've had a kind of National Enquirer version of Cayce, which is Cayce predicts, this kind of thing. And where we've had, I'm the reincarnated Edgar Cayce and, schmucks like that. So I think what we need to do is realize the fact that Cayce's work, a variety of scholars and reporters and people have looked at this, including Jess Stern, who was a New York Times reporter, who, when he went to write this best-selling book about Cayce called The Sleeping Prophet, going through those readings in Virginia Beach, he found something very interesting, which is when they asked Cayce back in 1944 who would help bring his work out, he mentions Stern, New York City. Well, there he is sitting there reading it 24 years later. Quite interesting. We have to understand the scope of Cayce's psychic vision and how powerful it is in relation to talking about this Atlantis rising theme, which we get through the mystery schools like Theosophy and Anthroposophy in the work of Steiner and Blavatsky, but we do not get this rich detail. Cayce's work in many ways is defined by his health readings, but right up there running second place is the Atlantis work, which is very, very extensive and very highly technologically advanced, the way he describes that civilization. Let's keep moving on. Olivia, I know you were trying to tell me that there was actually a tragedy in Virginia Beach tonight.
Yes, I guess there was a shooting and at least 11 people are dead, and it's only a few miles from the ARE.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
11 people?
At least. Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. Well, we're definitely going to get into the details on that, but terrible tragedy for all our friends in Virginia, and we hope everyone's hanging in there.
By the way, Lou Elizondo, I guess, was on Tucker Carlson
God.
tonight.
Yep.
So we had a question about that and whether Tucker's in on it. Does he know? What does he know? Well,
Tucker is just put out by Fox News to try to kind of gobble up the things that are popular that other newscasters won't deal with. So I've never seen anything particularly powerful on that show, except that, when Russian collusion was so hot, they weren't going for it. So that was good. But no, this is how they push it. This is a gigantic operation with TTSA and the way that they've been able to push the media to promote their show. And this is a very interesting thing because that show, if it fails, their whole operation fails. Everything is hinging on that show becoming popular. If the show does not do it, if they can't do it, and by the way, they do not have a lot of followers with all that money, even though they spent $37 million in losses and then an additional $9 million. What is that? $46 million losses. Incredible. They still do not have a good narrative. Their timeline has fallen apart. The best they can do for a frontman is Elizondo. It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. And the only thing kissing up to it is the mainstream media and kind of lackeys in the UFO field who, want to cash in And I don't think do their... Look, it's interesting, just to go off topic for a minute with Elizondo, in the show Unidentified, the fundamental problem with the show is that they don't take note of any of the history, which means that what they want to do is insert a CIA version starting December 2017. And here's Elizondo, and he talks to a few Navy pilots. Well, Linda Moulton Howe was talking to Navy pilots in 1981. You know, Oprah had a show about alien abductees with John Mack in 1997. That's 20 years ago. So we pretty much, you know, we know that there's something extra going on. You know, you had 10 years of the X-Files. I guess the public understands that there's something involved. So this idea that the CIA can dish out the UFO file and be like, hey, kids, we invented this cool thing, you know, and if you look at the op, they use the word cool a lot, you know, isn't this cool, you know, and Lou and all that, and Tom DeLonge. So it's aiming this at what they think is a dumb millennial. And after a while, you know, they're going to realize that the main fault, the basic fundamental thing that's missing in their operation is that they underestimated the staying power of the idea before they arrive. So that them trying to say, hey, we're Christopher Columbus and we've got the UFO file. No, sorry, no cigar. There've been, you know, I mean, Stanton Friedman passed away recently. Stanton Friedman, since the 60s, as a nuclear physicist, had brought forward the UFO file and information about the UFO file. And he was many times on this program. And, you know, so this idea that suddenly there's $1 million thing that's going to roll in and give you the UFO truth. No, definitely not. But the fact that the media is playing along with it is very dangerous, because the CIA controls the media and the CFR controls the media. So the Council on Foreign Relations and the CIA promoting this narrative instantly makes it dangerous, along with the fact that the Bilderberg meeting is taking place and that space is on their agenda for sure. As Catherine Austin Fitts warned us in 2015 that it was going to get to this level. This is something that we very much have to pay attention to and cut down with the facts, you know, so that we aren't subject to the fluff. And I called out people early in May with John Greenwald who were publishing press releases from TTSA as news articles. And, you know, I mean, that's just irresponsible journalistic practice. And they came back and defended it, saying, well, the people who put the press releases together were very, you know, knowledgeable. And so what they decided to do eventually was just have TTSA people write the op-eds, you know, cut out the middleman. So they're writing their own story, and they've got a lot of rah-rah activity from Newsweek and really, you know, Politico. These are groups in the media that don't have a lot of credibility to start with. So the way that I look at it, you know, a real journalistic examination starts with the fact, the point, the one question that no journalist has asked Luis Elizondo is, are you still a contract agent for the Central Intelligence Agency? Question one. George Knapp has had him on half a dozen times, 6 to 8 times, never asked him the question. You know, oh, isn't that great? You're risking everything. You risked your pension to come out. No, he didn't. Let's get real. And he also says that he can't say anything that's not in his NDA. So what is he actually risking? So we have to be very legitimate about it. If they want to do a kind of an entertainment show about UFOs, fine. But if you're going to have the CIA saying this is the real thing, you're going to get real journalistic scrutiny. And if you won't get it from the mainstream media, guess who's going to bring it? We're going to bring it, and others are going to bring it, and eventually you're going to hear it. So it is interesting, though, and I think that we're right in the middle of that kind of TTSA maelstrom. It's such a push, and it's such a frantic push to make everybody talk about the UFO thing. But I'll tell you, when I'm following those articles, the actual engagement on those articles and the comments on those articles, not very good. So they're doing something wrong. They haven't hit their stride in it yet. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think I answered that question.
Sure. I mean, to be honest, the subject is never closed. So
you can say that again.
Mm-hmm.
No, the UFO file forms the heart of the X series teganography research. That's just the nature of the beast. And I think the shows that we did recently with Dr. Joseph Farrell about the von Braun scenarios and the alien invasion card being the last one that they would play as a kind of fake alien scenario. And because I was talking today with Olivia, we were talking about this with the holograms, and the incredible potential of those holograms to do a faked alien invasion is much greater than it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So we have to look at things in a far different manner. And this even from people who support the idea of bringing UFOs to the mainstream, right, as we do. But we can't have our top people in the UFO thing glomming on. And by the way, I know that the TTSA is throwing around a lot of money. I have the real reports from people who they've offered the money to. So, money and influence and, all the rest of it. Hey, you're going to be part of this great project type thing. Just, park your conscience elsewhere for now. And in a way, you can look at it and say they did this kind of interestingly, because what they did is they kind of starved out the UFO field so that all the good researchers didn't really have a lot going on and didn't really have a very good income. And they had kind of framed the issue as such as to diminish the researchers involved with it. So you could come in with this thing at some point. If anyone gave you a hard time, it was going to be easy to buy them off, basically. So we have to be very careful. The Central Intelligence Agency is an extra constitutional force. And the people who created it, including Harry Truman, said it should be reformed or scrapped. Since it was never reformed and seemed to just grow, then I think from JFK, he also had the idea, we should turn these functions back over to the Pentagon and get rid of this thing, smash it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. There's a reason for that. And the Central Intelligence Agency, from the Iraq War, through Iran-Contra, all these different things, has played this role of obfuscation, and the Kennedy assassination, of course. So, no, the last place you would go for honesty about the UFO file, disclosure, any of that. And that's the message that is I think, absolutely important. Okay, before we move on with the hot zone, Miss Olivia, anything else?
Well, Brandon Jimenez said that the most important question is, how did they release the video when the Pentagon claims those videos are classified? The most important question is, who is leaking the videos?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a question that John Greenwald over at the Black Vault, who really, I think, has given them a really fair chance, and they won't go near him. God help them if they ever get on this show, because their story will be riddled with holes, and it's going to be very hard to hold a straight face. So over and over again, I think that we're seeing that, which is their story doesn't hold up for any normal journalistic integrity. So, if you want to just sit there and say, like, I'm this guy who came out, they were doing UFOs and I was upset because I quit. And then you find out that the program he was in ended in 2012 and he doesn't leave till 2017. So he hung around for 5 years collecting a paycheck. Elizondo's story is even more bizarre than the rest of the CIA people at the top tier of TTSA. And I think in the show Unidentified on the History Channel, which they're debuting it tonight, my impression is there's a lot of glitz in the production of it. But
it's so manipulative.
It is. It's very, very manipulative. And
anybody who doesn't watch TV anymore, you can really see it doesn't get to you in the same way that I used to enjoy. And it's hard.
Spoken truly.
You can't get sucked in the same way.
It is. And but I think the threat of false CIA disclosure is like false Atlantis disclosure, like Gigi Young was talking about. We have to have ways and means of questioning all the findings that come out. Now, some things that we have for the hot zone are the work of Paulina Zalitsky. Paulina Zalitsky was an oceanographer who had worked in Russia and had worked in Cuba. And then she had defected to Canada and developed a private company that was very good at underwater exploration. Castro rehired her in the 90s, even though she had been there actually in the 60s and 70s, a long time ago. And he rehired her to find Spanish galleons, supposedly. Whenever you get around this, Spanish galleons is the ultimate excuse. We looked into the fact that Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, was sent up and these capsules and these missions just stare down at the Hotzone. And when he retired, people would use that information to go looking for things. And over again, the code word was Spanish galleons. This is an easy go-to, oh, hey, it's a shipwreck. It has Columbus money on it. It's got to be a treasure. I don't believe for a second that Fidel Castro was looking for Spanish galleons. The Cuban Archaeological Society in the 50s had determined that the caves of Cuba were related to Atlantis and continued underwater. And Les Hemingway, the brother of Ernest Hemingway, when he was flying in to Cuba, he would see something off that western tip. We're also going to find out that Thomas Townsend Brown, unbeknownst to his family, who thought he was in San Antonio, Texas, was spending all this time in San Antonio, Cuba, on the western tip. And right on that western tip is what Polina Zalitsky found. Now, what she found would look very much to us like an Atlantean city underwater. And I've done shows relating her findings. We'll just take a quick look at what she was able to give to us. It's great. Whenever I pull up my sheets, Olivia, you laugh at this. I have a picture of Armand. you know he's waiting in the wings. This is what she found. Okay, now she sent down submersibles and got close to these things. And what did she see on them? Hieroglyphs. And they said, oh, Egyptian hieroglyphs when they were interviewing her. And she was adamant. She said, no, Mayan hieroglyphs. So this civilization is quite interesting. There is a researcher named Egerton Sykes, who was probably one of the best, but is not the best known, who was a British intelligence official who became obsessed with Atlantis and authored many books and edited classic works like Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, which was the first breakthrough book on Atlantis in the 19th century. But Egerton Sykes was around in the 50s through the 80s and donated his collection to the Association for Research and Enlightenment, who he felt, although a fair organization, had not done enough to represent Cayce's work on Atlantis. And he felt that they should take their research grants and the donations and things that people had given them and really go for this Atlantis issue. When I was speaking with Graham Hancock last weekend and we were talking about this, the entire book is about Atlantis in America. And he's right, because there are so many crossovers between the Native Americans and the Egyptians that there has to be some kind of interaction there, or they're drawing from some central legacy culture. So this is the nature of the situation as we find ourselves in. But Sykes, he estimated that the Celtic legends regarding Mirius were about Bimini. And those legends were quite interesting. They talked about crystal churches and gigantic healing centers. And he found out that the name Bimini actually meant wreathed or walled city. So we're getting into that, kind of Plato depiction of the city with the circular stones and the walls, the circular walls as you go in. I think we're looking at something definite there. But on the record, covered by the New York Times, covered by the Washington Post and National Geographic and all the rest, were Zalitsky's findings. And there they are, clear as a bell. So we know that the ruins are there underwater off the western tip of Cuba. Now the question is, what happened to this? What happened to all this research? Well, Zalitsky eventually was told by the Cuban Navy that they didn't need her anymore. And she also faced a number of very frightening situations, including being thrown in a Mexican jail. So they certainly, for the information that she had, this was not someone that they wanted out there as a free agent talking about this and doing things about it. And she did, in fact, withdraw, although she wrote two fascinating biographies. And I do expect that her work is going to get a major second look here. But this in-between civilization is actually discussed in the Cayce readings, where we have the main continent of Atlantis, which, again, on one side faces the Mediterranean, and on the other side faces the Gulf of Mexico. That's a large continent. But when it splits into three islands because of a group inside using the two-eyes stone and basically causing a nuclear reaction with it, something that we would say sets off volcanoes, it split the islands into threes. So they had basically their own kind of large-scale Chernobyl there with the Two Eyes Stone. And the three islands were called Poseidia, Arian, and Og in the Cayce readings. And what happens eventually is that Poseidia becomes the kind of headquarters of this Emilius group. And the way that the readings describe it is that the Emilius group wants this kind of spiritual interaction with this technology of the Two Eyes Stone, and that they train their priestesses to interact with beings from the outer spheres. This is exactly the way he describes it. The Belial group is very different. They've learned how to use the Two Eyes Stone basically as a laser, as like a death ray, and that they dominate lands around them using this technology, along with using it for flying machines and submarines and all kinds of conveniences. So it's a very tricky situation. By the time these lands go down in about 10,500 BC, apparently there is a landmass that existed and was still there between Cuba and Yucatan, because Polina Zalitsky, interestingly enough, found mountain ranges and evidences of mountain ranges between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. So there's a reference in the Cayce readings to Iltar taking his followers somewhere near Yucatan, and then another destruction happening and them having to migrate directly into what we know as Yucatan today and stash the Hall of Records there. So this other piece is known, Bimini is known as Murius in those Celtic legends. So this other piece was definitely connected with Bimini, and it somehow was in this area of the Hotzone. This is where the ruins are. Now, we know very close to the Hotzone is the Bermuda Triangle. That end of it is definitely, in the bizarre things that we've seen happen there, relate to this Apotheon Effect that I've mentioned on the program many times. And the Apotheon Effect kind of throws the traditional physics out the window when you're dealing with it. And we see that happen over and over again. In the Hotzone, this very likely is the same effect caused by the disaster of this Two Eyes Stone, and it may in fact be that Two Eyes Stone continuing to malfunction. Now, interestingly enough, and I'm going to do a program on this, the UFO sightings are off the charts in the Hotzone, and they're off the charts in the Bermuda Triangle, and you have to wonder why. We've seen that we have basically a massive underwater Area 51 off of Cuba, something called AUTEC. This is a very secretive organization, way more secret than Area 51 because it's underwater and its operations are underwater. So we're dealing with a whole kind of structure here that we need to acquaint ourselves with. And somehow it centers on this island of Bimini, and the Dodge family were very heavily vested in it. Now let's look at the figure of Edgar Cayce for a moment, because as I was trying to point out, it's very important to know Cayce as a very solid source. Now, this is someone who in his lifetime did over 14,000 readings. There are so many affidavits about him being correct in his readings, whether they were health readings or geological readings. And to just get some sense of that history without the showboat kind of National Enquirer, Gaia TV, BS version of Cayce and his legacy, thinking about really the possibility of the mystery schools working through someone who had this incredible psychic ability to tune into past events through something that he referred to as the Akashic Record, which is something that maintains a kind of memory, a kind of ethereal memory of everything that's happened here on Earth. By the end of his life, Cayce had given close to 1,000 readings on the subject of Atlantis, the most detailed history of Atlantis as we know it, and many hints that this was the era in which Atlantis was rising. And this caught the attention of many people, including Ernest Hemingway and figures as far-flung as John Lennon, who bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean for when this was going to happen. It seems that many people were ready for this to happen, but they weren't ready at the right time. And this period, this window that we're in, is very close. A few things about Cayce. When he was young, he lost his voice, and he was an insurance salesman and a photographer. And he could memorize any catalog or any book by touching it or sleeping on it. So he had unusual abilities even through his teens. But when he lost his voice, he was out of a job, and it was suggested to him by someone who was into homeopathy that they were familiar with hypnosis and maybe they could hypnotize him to get his voice back. And what happened was he began to speak in someone else's voice, this very deep voice, saying exactly what was wrong with his throat and to bring circulation to the throat. And in fact, this kind of laryngitis would follow him throughout his life. But what happened was he wound up sort of spitting up blood and his throat turned red. But after that, he could speak again. And so he began to trust the readings, and people heard about this and they began to come to him and say, like, well, you know, my wife has arthritis, or my husband has this problem. And they would come to him literally for these types of readings. And over again, he would try to do it, and he would start to develop a connection to this side of things. About 1918, the nature of the reading started to change, and someone named Arthur Lammers, who was a theosophist, came to him and asked him a series of questions relating to lost civilizations. And the subject of reincarnation came up for the first time in his readings. I will also mention that during this period, both Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla got readings from Edgar Cayce. And the Tesla reading is lost, so we have no way of, of reading that one, unfortunately. But Cayce's fame kind of started to spread. There was a New York Times article about him and how these doctors had done things while he was in trance and couldn't figure out how he was getting all this information. But Cayce's readings started to consolidate about this period of Egypt and Atlantis, and they started coming up more and more. And as a result, he was saying that there was an advanced culture back there, which was Atlantis, and that they went through a period very much like what we're heading into and where we are now, this kind of transhumanist period. And it seems like the kind of 100,000 years of development in Atlantis we've condensed now into a short period. Although in my opinion, they were severely ahead of us, you know, certainly in a number of ways. And also there's something very unusual about the Atlanteans and our heritage with them, which I would actually say is far more powerful than what we're talking about with UFO disclosure and the idea. Because really, when you get right down to it, the disclosure of the UFO file, in some sense, as far as the off-world civilization aspect goes, means that there's a peer civilization out there, maybe, you know, one that's more advanced, given their ships and their technology. But hardly, you know, I mean, this is not something to be worshipped. It's a peer civilization. Whereas when we go back to Atlantis, we're looking at a very high spiritual level of development. And, you know, as Plato said, when men walked as gods, there was something about this period that gave us access to tremendous realms of ability that seem like distant, echoed memories now. And if we can recapture that, my guess is that's a real threat to all those kinds of forces when we deal with this, because we're talking about something which goes to the human heritage part. It's very hard to manipulate. And if we remember that, then the whole game of, you know, kings and corporate overlords and all the rest is going to look pretty silly. So there's a vested interest in keeping us in the dark about this subject while studying it themselves. But I've outlined before that there are two groups involved when it comes to the X technology, and one of them is X Protect and the other one is X Share. You see this in circles in the government. You see this in circles in secret societies and the mystery schools, and at the height of political power, which is there are figures over time who are vested in getting the information of the X technology out to the public to move the culture forward. It's openly discussed in theosophical literature. But there's a group which it was secrecy and manipulation at all costs, even lethal costs. And the X Protect group, many of these stories about the Men in Black and all these other things come out of this group, which are just hell-bent on secrecy or distorting the truth. They might let pieces of it out, like the CIA is trying to do with the UFO file now. So this is a very dangerous, understanding that split, I think, is quite important. How are we doing over there, Miss Olivia?
Excellent. We're getting spectacular questions.
Yes, that's more like it. Everyone, I want to remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going deep into the hot zone, and you can see this is going to be a pretty heavy episode as we go along here. We're talking about Edgar Cayce in the hot zone, which is important because Edgar Cayce gave us the information about Bimini. That was not out there. This is something directly through him and his work that gave others like Egerton Sykes the impetus to go in there and really study this. And that's what's so crucial, I think, because we got so much information from them doing that. And so we have to look at Cayce's interaction with this aspect of the story is very, very significant. And remember that the person of Cayce is remarkable. There are so many psychics and there are so many people who've done research around Atlantis. Very few, and I mean very few, ever got into the league of Edgar Cayce. And Cayce was able to immerse himself in that experience. And I have to tell you that when you do this work looking at our antediluvian past, when you go into prehistory and these subjects like the mystery schools, if you don't go in with some kind of psychic foreknowledge, some type of intuitive guidance to go along with your academic research into it, you're not going to get very far. So, you'll get into a fascinating edge, but to bring the exsteganography aspects together when looking at the historical aspects, you're going to need that access to the Akashic part. You're going to need that intuitive ability. So it does make a big difference. And from working with someone like Gigi Young, I can tell you it makes a really big difference when it comes to this work and looking at these periods of humanity and their influence now. Okay, we did an episode recently on night side forces and what Edgar Cayce said the Atlanteans were working with night side forces over and over again, and that this was the essential nature of the problem with them. And night side, we've done our best to identify that. Obviously, this relates to that kind of apotheon question. And we can relate it more in our modern times to nuclear power has a positive and a very negative aspect. You can use nuclear power to run Iran, obviously, or, Iran can build a nuke and explode half the world with it. So we have to look at those questions and weigh them out. That gives us a kind of an idea. When we go back and we see how the X is used and utilized, we come up again and again with the mystery school aspects, and this is what fuels the Cayce work. Even the person who comes and starts asking those questions is from a public mystery school, being the Theosophical Society. In terms of exsteganography, now, when we look in history at philosophical figures like René Descartes, Descartes is the person who inserted X as the unknown into our math equation.
Everybody get that?
It was, in fact, Descartes. So this unknown X factor and where it comes from was inserted by Descartes. Well, Descartes, as it turns out, was in France there a Rosicrucian, although he kept it very, very secret. And it's come out over and over again in the literature studying his life that he was in fact a Rosicrucian. Well, the Brotherhood of the Rosicrucians is the group of the Rosy Cross. And this is a very fascinating group associated with the New Atlantis and really this kind of Western mystery school tradition versus the fully Eastern master's version. Descartes' book, his first major work on philosophy, basically gives us that snapshot, that kind of Rosicrucian imagery. And he was obsessed with reading Francis Bacon and Bacon's New Atlantis, giving us just a hint there of what's going on. But Descartes I think it's quite significant that he brings the X in so that we're using it in our math equations. He becomes aware of the X through the Rosicrucians. What do you got, Miss Olivia?
Thomas Tyson is so funny. So he said he inserted X. Isn't that putting Descartes before the horse?
Oh, yeah, right.
So,
unbelievable.
never.
If there were a drum roll to be had, we'd have it. So I want us to think about the X.
Wait, can I bring up the Descartes thing that
Yes.
I found out on Twitter today?
Yes.
This is what's
yes.
so great about synchronicities on Twitter.
Go ahead, go for it.
So Descartes, who is the father of modern science,
Yes.
the reason that happened is that he was visited by an angel.
Mm-hmm.
He had an angel appear to him in a dream who said, quote, "The conquest of nature is to be achieved through number and measurement," unquote. And that's what started everything. So
he is quite, yeah, there's no question.
And just an aside, this took place in which is in southern Germany, and the birthplace of Albert Einstein many years later.
Very interesting.
Interesting.
Fascinating. Well, I would also say that, you know, there's a whole Zanoni, for example, written by Bulwer Lytton, very much informed by Rosicrucian reality, is about a Rosicrucian who gets visited by an angel. So that's what that made me think of. So we can see that the X has these figures who help get it into the lexicon, who help get it out there. But again, X just used in mathematics, unless you knew it was steganography, you know, you would miss it, because that's the nature of X steganography. You're supposed to be able to miss it, because as it turns out, you know, only an initiate may understand. That's the way steganography works. When we look at the actual definition, and I always go back to this because it's important. This was written actually by Johannes Trithemius, and he was an abbot and most perfect master of natural magic. Very interesting. But he described steganography as the sure art of disclosing the intention of one's mind to those who are absent. The Greeks called it a text within a text. So to you and I, we might see something, you know, on the surface. For example, with the Rosicrucians, they might show a rose and then a cross, but that they understand the meaning of it, and we might just look at it and say, "Oh, isn't that a nice cross inside a rose?" But I do feel that understanding steganography in this sense is crucial. Now, we have a version of steganography for the 21st century, which is about, hey, something is embedded in that graphic, and this is how hackers move things along and all the rest of it. But they're drawing from this term, this idea of steganography, which was used largely by Hermetic groups in transferring information down to those who were in the know. And comes all the way down to us. The further back you go with X steganography, you're going to find it in the Book of the Dead. I mean, how far back can you go? To Atlantis, I guess. But it's been there with these groups all along. Now, this is interesting. Just a quick glimpse here of the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone, found in 1799 by Napoleon's army and given to the British army because of a prearrangement, and which they kicked themselves afterwards, and they wanted it back. But they found it, and it's the only reason, you know, before that, Egypt was just this land with a bunch of pretty pictures all over it. They didn't understand any of the text about it, and they couldn't read hieroglyphs. In fact, it took them 23 years through Jean-Francois Champollion to
Good job.
be able to interpret it. And fascinatingly enough, they disputed him even after he came out with it. So this is a long process. But the reason that we know it, just to be clear, is it's the same pronouncement, which is we pronounce our loyalty and our trust and, you know, our devotion to Ptolemy. And sometime around 150 BC, this took place, and they wrote it in the three popular languages. And interestingly enough, the hieroglyphs were on their way out because they were the picture language, and the written languages were there. So on the top, we have the hieroglyphs, the Egyptian hieroglyphs here, and then this is Demotic Egyptian, and below that's Greek. Well, the scholars could read that version of Egyptian, and they could read Greek, but they didn't know what hieroglyphs were. Once they figured out that the Demotic and the Greek were the same, they understood that the hieroglyphs would be the same. It's the same pronouncement in 3 different languages. I want us to think of the X the same way in this sense, which is we start to be able to see this pattern of the X steganography coming up through ancient texts, coming up in these crests, in these family crests, and coming up in heraldry and all the rest of it, and starting to get a picture of how they're related to it. By the time we reach the 20th century and the period we're in now, it's come to mean secrecy related to aerospace projects, which is why when we went through all this series about the X-planes and all the rest of it, you know, that technology that was designed by Walter Dornberger, the paperclip scientist that we brought over here, you know, the X-planes still hold the manned records for flying. You know, one of them's from 1959, you know, and so here it is 60 years later. How do they still hold the records? It's absurd. So there's something about this X technology and the way that these programs would go black and then resurface that I think is quite important. So we have to understand the X and its function. And if we can use the X to unlock these things like the mysteries and you know, the work of the mystery schools and the work of people like Cayce and bring it out of the shadows, then I think we have a real chance. Yes, Ms. Livia.
David Donaway wanted to know, did the Steiner and Cayce readings on Atlantis coalesce?
In large part, they do. In large part, they do. You know, whenever you specify dates, there's a very interesting date that Cayce gives for when they were collecting this death ray in order to get rid of these giant beasts. Well, it sounds a lot like the dinosaurs, although they were supposed to have been eliminated in 65 million BC. Well, in order to get rid of the gigantic beasts that were overrunning the earth, all these nations got together in Atlantis and decided from this one death ray station, we're going to take them out. And they asked him, what was the date of the meeting? And he said 50,722 BC, you know, like it was yesterday. So we're talking about a long period of history here of advanced technology back there, and then a real dark age that humanity gets plunged into, and that the work of Robert Bauval, Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, they understand that when studying those cultures over and over again, the cultures say that they're legacy cultures, so that the teachings were transmitted down to them. But more than just the fact that they had great technology or something, they understood the spiritual interface of the technology with humanity. This is the crucial element that we're missing. So we're going to keep rolling here. I do just, because so many people have sent it to me, and it is interesting to look at it, which is the Madonna Madam X aspect coming in the way that it is. You are seeing X, and I've shown it in Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all the rest. They have their ways of hinting at it, and you know, sometimes X will just come up because, hey, someone's using that letter. But over and over again, I think this is very unusual. When Madonna was talking about doing her Madam X thing, the Madam X is supposed to bring light to dark places, which is strangely enough.
Luciferian, thank you.
Well, think about where she's going with that. It's quite remarkable. But Nimza actually sent me something relating to the new Godzilla movie. And this is very remarkable. First of all, the Godzilla movie is coming out, I believe, tomorrow.
No, I think it's out tonight.
Oh, tonight. And so it's the Godzilla, that's the TTSA, right? That's Elizondo's the new Godzilla. So we do that. Is coming out, but there's all of this X steganography around it. First of all, they launched, as related to it, all these Godzilla X Fests, which is just a funny, you know, strange coincidence. But here you want some coincidences around Godzilla. Let's look at the themes that they're rolling out through Hollywood and the mainstream media. Godzilla resides underwater in Atlantis. This is where they get him up. They drag him up from. Interestingly enough, there's a few other things to actually print it out, but I won't go too deep into it. Oh, wait, I do have it. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. Here we go. The new movie. Now, just check out some of these very unusual synchronicities. And Olivia, you in particular are going to love these. Mm-hmm. Okay, so through these mythological texts, he reveals this monster Zero, Ghidorah, is an ancient alien who serves as Godzilla's primary rival for apex predator. Okay, a Mothra emerges from a cocoon and flies to Bermuda. I'm just guessing she's not going there for vacation. Then they have something in the submarine called the Monarch Team. Okay.
Whoa.
We know that's classic mind control name program. I thought that was interesting. Then suddenly they're in Boston. And Emma, one of the heroes, realizes the destruction of Ghidorah and the other Titans will bring in far worse than what humans could inflict. Okay, so Madison overhears this and steals the orca, one of these things, and in Fenway Park, okay, where we were in Fenway Park, what, last August. We saw Billy Joel there, thanks to our friend Chuck. Thank you, Chuck. And as it turned out, Ghidorah arrives in Boston, one of the monsters, and attempts to destroy the orca, with Godzilla appearing with Monarch's assistance to engage it. So what happens is this all goes down, and they converge on Skull Island at the end of it. And so they're doing this big hoedown, and they send the signal right out of Fenway Park to do it.
Incredible.
So,
I can't wait.
It's always art imitating life and vice versa. But we have a lot of pop culture references, is the point, to the extegonography. And I do believe that, some of them are coincidences, of course. But there are hints that the extegonography is also coming into the open, just as the Atlantis Rising and the UFO file are. And the truth is that we have to be ready in a variety of ways, which is we have to understand that a lot of these things are going to be rolled out in an entertainment fashion. They even talk about how it's going to be entertainment, and they show us through entertainment. But we have to understand the roots, and this is why groups like Anthroposophy and the work of Rudolf Steiner, Steiner spent, in my estimation, 30 years trying to tell us about Ahriman. Yes, Steiner did biodynamic farming. Yes, he left behind the legacy of the Waldorf schools. Yes, he left behind anthroposophy and spiritual science, and he left behind eurythmy. But in fact, if you look at it, the real overriding thread in his work is Ahriman. And what is Ahriman? Ahriman is a terrifying consciousness, lower astral consciousness that possesses us through technology, and is the great challenge for humanity in the 21st century. So when we see the transhumanism come up, then we know we're in pretty deep. Now, he spent time on this subject and even sculpted Ahriman to get an idea of what this was. And, I'm fond of showing this picture because it captures the time and what Steiner feels that we're up against. And I feel really in this case that Steiner is giving us that message that, this isn't something that we can run from, but it's something that we must engage properly. And that if we are not caught unawares, then we can actually gain for humanity. But the goal in Steiner's cosmology here of the Ahrimanic groups are to take mankind off that path, to put them into this eighth sphere artificial step of evolution. And so we find over and over again people on the ground, the work of Edgar Cayce, giving us that hint about Atlantis before these people can come along and make up their version of the story. He's giving us the real thing. He's telling us where it is, and he's also telling us the families that are associated with bringing it up. Very important. Yes, Miss Livia.
Nimza said the end of the movie is basically a bow down to the Rad Lab.
Yes, excellent point. Excellent point. Well, MIT's Rad Lab controlled the UFO file, and the main reason it was given that authority through Vannevar Bush and John Trump, let's not forget, who was Trump's uncle, and who we've done now. The most popular episode of the entire X series is Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule. And that's all about John Trump and his relationship with this. It's funny, after that, Olivia and I would go to MIT and we would request all of John Trump's papers to be viewed. And you get usually a 72-hour waiting period. And all of the work was in. Hold on. All of the work was in Box X. Mm-hmm. So you can't make that up. I mean, think about how remarkable that is. So the trail is there. Now, there's nothing important. There's important things, but there's nothing mind-blowing. There's no smoking gun in John Trump's papers at MIT. But the fact that they're in box X gives us that hint. They're using that routing symbol, that X steganography, so those people, when they go through it, can know. I think that's pretty good. Yes, Bo Krills.
He just said, stop ruining the movie. We have to start talking about it.
Godzilla fan. We've known a few.
I have one other question.
Of the original Japanese.
Oh,
yes,
so
one
good.
more. Go ahead.
So Marco Galrito wanted to know, was it an Ahrimanic angel? Was it an Ahrimanic angel who inspired Descartes?
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think Descartes understood that we were going to have this opportunity, if you really read him, to kind of cater to humanity's whims. But he had I think, therefore I am thing. So he was actually dealing with a lot of existential aspects too. So no, I think this is more of his Rosicrucian side that he kept hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And the Zanoni, the Bulwer Lytton novel, may actually reference Descartes. It's possible. But yeah, I don't see that as harmonic, although I understand by the time you get to 1840 and the scientific materialism, that's all they want to do. And they're not looking at the spiritual side by then at all. It's just what can be weighed and measured, and that's it. So they're asking you to eliminate an entire part of your thinking, And I think of this, I don't want to extrapolate out too far, but think of like TTSA, right? And the CIA op behind things like that in the media. They're trying to say, forget all of the UFO file information that you have based on people's testimony, scientists, pilots, and all the rest of it. We just discovered this thing in 2017. This is what you're going to learn. Forget about that. And we're even going to rename it. So you have different types of loyalties and associations with it. So you see, that's an insidious program. And that's what the CIA is classic for. And that's why that's CIA disclosure, fake disclosure. And of course, you can have the real thing. All you have to do is study the UFO file. You'll never get the pronouncement from on high about the real thing anyway, because the way that it works is, as long as there's some advantage to be had, they would keep that secret for, until kingdom come, basically. So what I want to do here, I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. Wow, it's fantastic. This is a great crowd tonight and great questions. We're going to have questions in the second half of the program, which we're up to here soon. And everyone just ask the questions in caps so Olivia can get through it and grab the questions. It makes it a little bit easier for sure. Make sure you go to the Dark Journalist website, get behind the program, subscribe to the program. We made it incredibly affordable, $5 a month. It's $60 a year. And the benefits that you're going to get being a part of Dark Journalist in 2019, this summer, are going to far outweigh any expense in that department. But I've been saying this for a while. Don't hold back when it comes to the real important information that's out there. And, I think of the work that's out there now with Solari.com and Catherine Austin Fitz and her work. And an interview is coming up with her in June. Dr. Farrell's work at GizaDeathStar.com, Forbidden Knowledge TV, Alexandra Bruce, The Dark Journalist Show. These things are here. And this is the time to support them. This is the time to get behind them. The information is here for you. And this is not a period to kind of hang out on the fence and wonder what's going to happen. So get behind those things that are giving you that kind of life, that knowledge that you'll need to move forward in a conscious fashion, and try to leave off the stuff, the junk conspiracy, which we have so much of, and is swarming around the entire nature of the thing. There's so many fascinating books. If you're reading Joseph Farrell's book, McCarthy, Monmouth, and the Deep State, which is really about the UFO file, and we did a fantastic episode on that, you're going to get so much of an education reading that book, which is available on Lulu. Walter Bosley's new book, Esoteric, Napoleon, absolutely fascinating. Catherine Austin Fitts has released a book about her struggle to get the missing trillions over the 20 years out as a major story. You know what she did? She released it online. It's free. This is incredible, the amount of work that's available for you to be educated about these things. It's a fantastic period. I feel very inspired to have these people here and doing it. And when I was with Graham Hancock last weekend, I was thinking to myself, with his America Before and the quest to find this lost civilization and their footprints, you know, so much of this work is coalescing. We still have these incredible people here, and there's very few figures like Graham anywhere who can tackle this with that scholarly manner that he has and really do the you know, it's one thing to have the theories and the rest, but to be able to back it up on the ground and debate anyone anywhere, to have that legacy behind John Anthony West and the work with Schock and all the rest. I mean, this is quite remarkable. So we really need to get behind these things now, and have them, you know, have the shows and the authors that we know who are giving us the good information. Let them know that you have their back, and you know, it certainly helps us out here at the show too. Sign up for the newsletter, which is free, and that'll keep you updated and posted on all the amazing shows we have coming up. We have Alana Freeland and the Space Fence coming up for June, and a real bombshell coming up in July that I'm not going to announce yet. But I mean, all the shows are bombshells, but this one's going to be pretty good. All right, Miss Olivia.
Well, I'm going to cut right to the chase. Mark Anthony wanted to know, what did Cayce say about now? Anything? I love questions like this.
He did. He said that we were entering into this period where that we were facing a gradual set of Earth changes that were going to change not only weather patterns, but that land masses were going to sink and land masses were going to rise. And that there was going to be a great struggle between this higher consciousness that was going to be rising and the attempts to hold on to the old world. And I have to say that the person who fast forwards a lot into the 21st century is Steiner. And he talks a great deal about how we need to apprehend the tools of the technology so that we don't become sucked into the machine, as it were. And so he refers to it as Ahriman. Interestingly enough, when you study Ahriman and you study Belial in the Cayce readings, they crisscross so perfectly. The Ahrimanic forces are the Belial forces. And the Belial forces in Atlantis caused the Great Destruction by taking the Two-Eye Stone and using it to dominate the populace. The Emilius group inside of Atlantis, according to the Cayce readings, used the Two-Eye Stone to interface, to train the purification of the priestesses to interface with beings, spiritual beings from the outer spheres. Now, you can interpret that a number of different ways, but fundamentally, it made them initiates in this process, and that's what the crystal was for. So I always say this, imagine now pulling up your laptop, and instead of just looking at a website, you're interfacing with a spiritual being. That's the way I look at the Two-Eye Stone, which is they were using the technology to tap into what we don't have access to here so easily in the material realm. But enough of my description of what Cayce had to say in these readings. Let's read some of the readings. And then we're going to go a little more into the Dodges and how this very much plays out the Bimini Temple rising aspect with the Dodges in tow. But first, we're going to see what he had to say about them. Okay. Couple of quick things relating to the Hall of Records. This series is the 996 series of readings, Edgar Cayce reading. Okay. As indicated, the records of the manners of construction of the Two-Eye Stone are in 3 places in the earth. 3 places contain that information about how to build this crystal power station. In the sunken portions of Atlantis, or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater, near what is known as Bimini off the coast of Florida, and in the temple records that were in Egypt, where the entity later acted in cooperation with others in preserving the records that came from the land where these had been kept, Atlantis. Also, the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America, where these stones that they know so little about are now being discovered. Now, these stones that they know so little about, he referred to as firestones, which are miniature versions of the two-eye stone. Think of it as kind of like a portable power station. And he was saying that they were running across them in their excavations in the Yucatan, which is quite remarkable. And also, when we bring into this picture that the Dodges were very close to Firestone, and how the Dodges and Firestone worked together on automobiles, and how Firestone had very unusual esoteric ties. This is going to bring this all together. Okay, let's see if I can pull this off. We're doing well so far. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's episode 55, Edgar Cayce in the Hotzone, the Atlantis Temple Bimini mystery revealed. Okay, so now we're moving into these 440 readings. This is a group that came to Cayce, and they were businessmen, and they were asking about the business development of Bimini. It gets very, very strange. And what will happen is, for the first time, the copy of the follow-up readings after this will be stolen. Now, the Cayces kept a copy of every reading that was done. So the fact that this one was stolen, and then we're going to find out after the fact that this person who had these readings in the group that he represented would show up later in New York when Cayce was giving a lecture. And then very mysteriously, when Cayce came down to meet him to be like, hey, whatever happened to you guys, he would disappear. So something was going on with these readings about Bimini and the group that he was giving the readings to. And they would, in fact, disappear along with the copy of that third set of readings. Okay. About the two-eye stone. The preparation of the two-eye stone was in the hands only of the initiates at the time. And the entity was among those that directed the influences of the radiation that arose in the form of the rays that were invisible to the eye, but that acted upon the stones themselves as set in the motivating forces, whether the aircraft that were lifted by gases in the period, or whether the more guiding the more pleasure vehicles that might pass along close to the earth, or what would be termed the crafts on the water or under the water. So he's saying the Atlanteans had all of these. This is pretty advanced technology. And the time period that we're looking at here is maybe around 25,000 BC, quite significant. In the active forces of these, this entity brought destructive forces by the setting up in various portions of the land the character that was to act as producing the powers in the various forms of the people's activities in the cities, the towns, and the countries surrounding same. These, not intentionally, were tuned too high and brought the second period of destructive forces to the peoples in the land and broke up the land into the isles that later became the periods when further destructive forces were brought into the land. So what happens is basically these power stations are feeding these communities and towns the way we would feed them with electricity now. But at some point when they were doing this, they were tuned too high and brought a natural destruction. After this period of time, the Belial group gets their hands on the technology. They're already using it for conveniences and things, but they decide to actually use it more for war and for this type of really dominating the other cultures. Interestingly enough, before this, Atlantis, according to the Cayce readings, is purely pacifist. There's no warlike tendencies in the Amelius group. Let's keep trekking. Now, he's discussing this period. This comes straight from those readings that he's giving. Through this same fire that the two-eye stone was developed, the bodies of individuals were regenerated by the burning through the application of the rays from the stone, the influences that brought destructive forces to an animal organism. Hence, the body rejuvenated itself often and remained in that land until the eventual destruction, joining with the peoples that made for the breaking up of the land, or joining with the Belial group. at the final destruction of the land. In this, the entity lost. At first, it was not the attention nor the desire for destructive forces. Later, it was for the ascension of power itself. By the way, what you find is that many of the people he gives readings for, when he looks back over their lives, he's saying, you were part of the Emilius group, but you got sucked into the Belial group. And that the Belial group kind of infiltrated there and took over the Two-Eye Stone, and that was sort of the end of the culture. There's no doubt that there's a parallel here with what we're seeing. So when they ask him now, they're trying to figure out what's going on here, like, how can we read these? And they're starting to ask him questions and push him. And he's saying, look, you have to purify yourself. And it's going to come up here briefly. So they say, how many facets do the crystals previously referred to have? And Cayce says, wouldn't it be better were these taken from that pattern of same? They will eventually be put in the museum in Pennsylvania. Now he's saying that the stones that they're finding, the firestones that they find in the Yucatan, are going to be carried to the University of Pennsylvania. For as given, do not confuse yourself in the attempt to use something without having prepared yourself to know what to do with it, and bring unintentionally, as before, destructive forces in the experience of yourself and those about you. Not that this should not be sought, not that information should not be asked for, but be sure that the records are read, and those who have been given may only be read by those who have cleansed themselves or purified themselves. So he's saying you can't just as an engineer, as a group, recreate these things. You have to be coming from this initiate spiritual place, or else you can misuse the very things that you find. It's a very strange warning there, and he gives them a lot of these warnings as if he's dealing with kind of an unscrupulous group here. It comes up quite a bit. But he says this, which I think gives us a hint about what's down there. Quote, there will be within these developments many things that have as yet not even been thought of or considered, that would not only of themselves attract a great horde, but also attract great wealth. For this is the first of the highest civilization, Bimini, Atlantis being the high civilization. This is the first of the highest civilization that will be uncovered in some of the adjacent lands to the west and south of the Isles. See? And then they say, is this the continent known as Poseidia? And Cayce says a temple of the Poseidians was in a portion of this land. And then he goes through to tell them all the minerals and things, which is quite remarkable. And you can see that the incredible psychic eye of Cayce going through the strata, going through the layers that make up Bimini, and what even right down to the sulfur that's in the water. Just an amazing psychic vision that he had to look through these things. But these people are asking him, and they're working on this. And then in the middle of this, Dodge comes up. It says, give the full name of the people to undertake the financing of this. And Cayce says, preferably that group as we have given, as is seen as the natural trend, will be in the Dodge forces. And then what he mentioned back there is that the Dodge forces at one point ruled in Poseidia, and that they had a great interest in Bimini, so that this would be a natural. Now we have to find out here, in looking at this, how the Dodges knew that this information about Bimini was there. Well, we see them using the Theosophical logo as their logo for the company. So we're starting to get a hint there that they have this deep connection to the mystery schools, and that this tradition of the mystery schools holding the exteganography, holding these secrets about Atlantis rising and Bimini being a part of that, somehow they get access to that information, which is what Cayce is saying here. They're already set up for this. These are the people to ask. So he goes on further, and I'm just going to shortcut to the last part about the Dodges here. How are you doing over there, Olivia?
Excellent. Great questions.
Okay, good. We're going to hop to your questions shortly. Make sure that they're in caps as we go. Mm-hmm. It's fantastic. Again, tonight, just excellent questions and a great crowd.
Oh my God, outstanding questions. Really mind-blowing.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. So
I'm going to ask it right now.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Okay,
Sure.
so NIMS again. Is the 5G and geoengineering agenda a way to artificially recreate the local conditions of Atlantis, a strong electromagnetic medium in which a two-eye stone could actually function?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about it, the instructions for constructing the two-eye stone again are in the 3 Hall of Records, one by the Sphinx, one in the Bimini Temple, and one in Yucatan. The fact that they can control, like a global control grid, the entire Earth with the two-eye stone back then makes it very tempting for them to recreate it. There's no question about it. I believe that all the pressure that you see in relation to Cuba, I know there are political forces at work here, but when you see these things rising and being kind of smashed together, like the UFO file, like the Trump Space Force, and then suddenly we know that the land is rising off the east coast of America, and we have Cayce talking about the Temple of Poseidian, and we already have the Bimini Wall that he predicted there. We know that this stuff is in motion. These groups, the geopolitical tension is working in these groups. Egerton Sykes, who I cited earlier, British intelligence officer who studied for 4 decades Atlantis, said that there were 3 primary groups that were involved in being after these ruins: Russia, the US, and Cuba. And China was kind of like trailing around at the time. So a lot of the sparring that we see with Cuba, as we have seen before, and in the case of Hemingway in Cuba with Castro, and the great efforts, even risking a national security incident that JFK took to get the capsule, the vault of Hemingway out of Cuba. We know that these things have been going on. And now when we see that we're putting these sanctions on Cuba, which we have not done since 1962, you know, I mean, there was some activity like this under Reagan, but this is full blown, you know, after we've opened an embassy there and all the rest of it. So something very, very unusual about our approach towards Cuba, and it is starving out that economy. This is a problem, and it relates, in my opinion, to the lack of access to the western tip of Cuba by American forces, and the fact that they don't want this group to have access to that before they get their hands on it. I think that there's always been a lot of tension relating to this, and we've demonstrated it in a number of shows, but I think it is worth pointing out. Okay, so I think we get the point there, because what he rounds out this reading with, as he said, this would become a strategic point, Bimini, in the affairs of this continent, but also of others, as it has been in eons past. Let's think about this. Why Bimini, this tiny island that it takes 2 hours to get to from Miami, that is basically known as a resort and known for its wonderful bread? How on earth would it become a strategic point in the affairs of this continent, America, but also of others, as it has been in eons past? There's something very, very unusual he's alluding to here. And the Cayce readings were like this. They would give us real things to work with, and they would sometimes not elaborate. It was kind of like, here, you know, like, take it for what it's worth. Now, I do want to point out that the Firestones and that whole end of the story gets very, very strange, because he says that they're in the Pennsylvania Museum and people have looked for them. And what happened was there were a series of Yucatan excavations. And one of the unusual ones that took place in Yucatan were related to this group that was there in a place called Piedras Negras, which back then was called Yucatan, but which later they sectioned off what Yucatan would be called. And the researchers who've looked at it, like Greg Little and Andrew Collins, are looking more at that end of the spectrum. In the case of Collins, he actually thinks that Cuba is a good candidate for Atlantis, interestingly enough. But what we're seeing here is this group now of the 996 readings, they say, look, this is going really well, but here's something that we need. We need you, Edgar Cayce, to come out of Virginia Beach and come with us to Bimini. We need you to read in Bimini. That's very unusual. So they want to bring Cayce into the Hotzone. Somehow they understand that if he's there, he'll be able to read better for them about it. Cayce's vision and his psychic vision could go all over the world, and he could give someone a diagnosis if they were sitting in San Diego and he was sitting and going into trance in Virginia Beach. And he could read for people in Italy or Canada. So why is it so important for this group to bring him down to Bimini? Well, the group itself is very mysterious, as I pointed out. And what happens is, when they get those follow-up readings, a copy, if you look in the records, there are notes around the readings, and the copy of the reading disappears. So no one knows what was in that final set of readings. But somehow having him in the Hotzone was crucial for these people. Oddly enough, the business group itself seemed to be something of a front. They came in there, they asked their questions, they pretended it was going to be about oil, which is absurd. And then, little by little, they're pressing him and they say, what about this aspect? What about the crystal aspect? What about this? What about that? And he says, whoa, you need to be an initiate to understand these things. Don't get into it like you did before. And the way that Atlantis blew up the area last time, handle it differently. This I find very fascinating. And when we really take a look at what is happening with Cayce here, is he's being kind of almost bullied a little bit to get the information out. And Cayce was kind of a people pleaser in a sense.
Kind of.
That's no question about it. And often got himself into financial trouble because of this overextending himself to others. So it's quite interesting when this happens. Now, very crucially, 2 years later, 2 years after these readings, Cayce goes and he gives a speech in New York City. And the same guy who now has mysteriously disappeared and the business front that was with him disappeared, shows up and he's in the audience. And Cayce sees him and has that recognition, thinking, oh, I'm going to talk to this guy afterwards and see if he ever found that Poseidian Temple off Bimini or the treasure he's looking for. And he finishes the lecture and he gets down off the lectern and boom, he comes down, the guy's gone. Guy just wanted to check him out, I guess. Never heard from him again. So many unusual things about Bimini, including the fact that Ernest Hemingway took up residence there and spent all of his time between Bimini and Cuba. There's so many secrets in the Hemingway family relating to this, and the pressures brought to bear, including the fact that Hemingway's son was a CIA agent who was diametrically opposed to him. And Hemingway hated the CIA and felt that they were hounding him. Along with his unusual alliance with John F. Kennedy at the end of his life, and the fact that JFK wanted him there at his inaugural, didn't happen. And supposedly, Hemingway committed suicide under unusual circumstances. And later, his family line, who's Mariel and Margot are the two most famous, and their dad being in the CIA, being Hemingway's son, both of them would struggle dramatically in their lives, including Margot taking her own life. And then we think about this incredibly close relationship that Castro had with Hemingway there in Cuba. And all this emphasis of Hemingway spending time with Cayce, his mother spending time with Cayce and getting these readings for Ernest. And Hewlin Cayce, Cayce's son, going and staying for a month with the Hemingways in Illinois. All these things start to give us a picture. And we start to understand that there's some mystery there that people were aware of. And the track seems to be through Cayce and his Bimini readings, something to do with Dodge, the Dodge family. Firestone. Now, as a quick addendum on that, I want to get into Firestone real briefly, and then we're going to go to you, Miss Olivia.
Mm-hmm.
I want to point this out. This is maybe another blockbuster here, and you're watching the Dark Journalist program. Boy, it's fantastic to have so many people here. And, we did the Graham show last week live in Cambridge, so we weren't able to do the live chat here, so it's nice to see everybody. And like I said, we are going to have that available coming up shortly. But very often on this program, there's some research that just kind of blows your mind when you get into it, because so many things are there, and that's why I spend so much time on it. I find it just absolutely fascinating. This part is particularly interesting whenever you're getting around Hemingway in relation to Cuba and Cayce's readings in the Hotzone. You're real close. You're real close to that X aspect. We're getting, that's right in the heart of it. You can kind of feel it. It starts to palpitate. Okay, this is a shot of Ernest Hemingway here, very young. And he is eventually going to make his home in Bimini and Cuba. The person who will be his lifelong companion, hang out with him and his wife, is this fellow back here, William Dodge Horn. William Dodge Horn is a distant relative of the Dodges, and he will create the largest wing of Ernest Hemingway material in any library anywhere except for the JFK library here in Boston. So as it turns out, that wing is in the Firestone wing of the Princeton Library. Firestone, again, these figures, Hemingway, Firestone, the Dodges, this entire move. Now, just in case we think that's a coincidence, there's a couple of things here that are going to tell us otherwise. First, meet the Millionaires Club, Ford, Edison, and Firestone. We all know these figures, these incredible industrial titans from history. Keep them in mind as I read this. Now, this is a historical document about Fuller's North Branch Outing Club in Michigan. Considered rustic by today's standards, the 20-room lodge also welcomed the likes of Charles Nash, John and Horace Dodge, who we've been spending time with, the Dodges, the Dodge brothers, Walter Chrysler, A.P. Sloan, well, Sloan's going to become very important in a minute here, John D. Rockefeller Jr., Thomas Edison, and Harvey Firestone. Of course, both in the Millionaires Club, both spending very interesting time by the Great Lakes in Michigan. Ford was also fond of the fresh waters of Lake Michigan, and of course, the Dodge brothers worked for Ford at the time until they got enough money to get free. And Ford was honored as the top inventor by the Nazi Party in 1938. Ford kept a picture of Hitler on his desk, and Hitler kept a picture of Ford on his desk.
I didn't know that. Hitler kept a picture of Ford. Wow.
It's nothing like having a picture of old Adolf on your desk there. Ford, incredibly close to that X technology, off the charts. Now, Ford was also fond of the fresh waters off Lake Michigan. But let's go back to this list again. Here we go. Ready? Charles Nash, John and Horace Dodge, Walter Chrysler, A.P. Sloan, John D. Rockefeller, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and the yet-to-be-published author Ernest Hemingway during the early part of the 20th century.
Wait a second. He was yet to be published? So he was a nobody?
He was a nobody.
So what was he doing hanging out with all these successful people?
Why do we have our friend here, Ernest Hemingway, before he's anybody? By the way, he's holding a gun here.
Big surprise.
Just to give you an idea. Hemingway there. John D. Rockefeller. Henry Ford. And then that Millionaires Club, Edison, all the rest of it. Everybody makes sense. But yet to be published author Ernest Hemingway. He's there. So we start to get an idea. We're starting to get a picture. Now, let's take a look at something that'll give us some hint or inspiration about who the Dodges were after all. This is the Dodge Mausoleum, their burial place, right outside of Detroit, Michigan. And in fact, what we have here, first off, it says Dodge here. I guess you can't really see it, but that is DODG, and it's easy to look up, the Dodge Mausoleum. And we have two grand Egyptian sphinxes guarding this Egyptian-style mausoleum outpost. This is who these people were. Remember Cayce saying that the Hall of Records was beneath the Sphinx in Egypt. They understand the motif. And there they were in Bimini. And here was that group saying, where should we go? And Cayce's telling them, go to Bimini. That's a larger shot of that kind of Egyptian temple mausoleum that they set up with the sphinxes in front for the Dodge brothers, who died in the same year, remember. So this is actually, it's giving us that understanding of the Dodges in relation to this Atlantis mystery. More of them and the Sphinx temple. Now,
wait, did you show the picture of the grays on the door? You have to do that.
No, I have to see if I can find it. I will tell you this. That's a good one, I know. I should have put that aside. Olivia finds the best stuff. Now, I went looking for who would have built this for the Dodgers at the time. And interestingly enough, I found there was an industrialist in Pittsburgh named Winter who had pretty much built the same thing, which was remarkable to me. And we'll take a quick look at it. They also have this kind of two serpents and the wing, the Egyptian mausoleum. And this is Winter, is the name of the industrialist there in Pennsylvania. Again, in Pennsylvania, it comes up a lot. Of course, the Rosicrucian Society being there, and also, in addition to that, this strange thing about the Pennsylvania University or State Museum where the Firestones were taken from Yucatan. More of Winter's mausoleum, very unusual Egyptian-style figurines. These people were deep, deep, deep into Egypt. Interestingly enough, I had showed some of these to Gigi Young, and she said, what's interesting to me when looking at this is that their sphinxes, although they have the male, they should be female. And I found that very interesting. Later on, when looking at Winter's, here we have a female sphinx. Very interesting indeed, getting more and more deeper imagery. The female sphinx is certainly not traditionally associated with the Egyptian mysteries. So that was a good one, a good one to pick up on. I went deeper looking for this type of architecture, and I found in the Woolworth family, oddly enough, here we were, of course, Woolworth, massive commander of industry at the time with tons of chains of clothing stores and kind of discount appliance stores.
They were kind of like the Walmart of their day.
They really were, yeah. And everyone knew them in the period, and there's still probably a few Woolworths around. Of course, the chief titan of Woolworths, there's his mausoleum with the Sphinx guarding it out front. So the people involved here understand they've got the money, they've got the insight, and they understand something relating to the Egyptian imagery and the Sphinx aspect. And in the case of the Dodges, it seems unequivocally, since Cayce's pointing to them directly, that they know very much about this, but they're also deep on the X technology side. I want to point out that military intelligence is also using the Sphinx imagery in their logo, and that they use it with an X, and they show the apotheon of the lightning bolt and the key, that it's the key to wisdom. I want to point that one out here. This is their logo using the Sphinx. Again, the intelligence sector, the elite money sector, the major industrialists trying to exploit and extrapolate the X technology sector. we're getting these forces together. We're seeing the extegonography. We're seeing the Egyptian Atlantean imagery coming through. This is giving us the strong hint. And of course, we come right back where we started, which is the Dodges and their most unusual Sphinx guarding their death mausoleum. There's more to say in relation to the Dodges, but what I want to kind of sum up with is this. Cayce had a very unusual position, which is, in my opinion, he's selected by the mystery schools to bring the Egyptian information out so we can recapture it in this era. And in fact, his work becomes popular around Atlantis in 1968 through the bestseller, The Sleeping Prophet by Jess Stern. Eventually, Hewlin Cayce will write Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, which for me is the definitive book on Atlantis. And he would update that book in the 1990s. A series of books come out from Berlitz and all the rest of it about Atlantis, but really, the Cayce information brings that forward. But in the heart of it, always, is that the first to rise is the temple at Bimini. Always. So when we look at it that way, Bimini is crucially important. When we look at the business group who was kind of pushing Cayce around to get these readings, they have to take him to Bimini. They know something, that he has to be there in order to get that picture of the temple and the two-eye stone and all the rest of it. And in fact, he does the reading, and the copy of the reading disappears. So we're getting a real, I think, handle on how important Cayce's work here and how they tried to exploit it. And then around this, in the heart of Bimini, are the Hemingways. And the Hemingways and their great interaction between Bimini and Cuba are all about the Hotzone and all about those ruins that are down there. There's some secret deep in the work that Hemingway was doing there. And we know that he was looked at as a spy and that he despised the Central Intelligence Agency surveilling him. But in fact, apparently what he was doing was spending all this time doing these observations in the Hotzone for someone. And the information that he had accumulated, he put in a vault in Cuba, as we've pointed out, and JFK on record. These records only came out within the last 5 years or so. Has a national security meeting with the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, with the CIA director, and with Ed Lansdale, who's the liaison between the Air Force and the CIA. And they discuss a national security incident and the possibility of a national security incident inside of Hemingway's villa. And every major historian for the Kennedys, like Arthur Schlesinger, had no idea what they were talking about. And then later, Kennedy will work with Hemingway's widow to smuggle the vault out of Hemingway's villa on a shrimp boat back to the United States, where supposedly it ends up at the JFK Library. But in fact, friends who are close to Hemingway's widow, Mary Hemingway, say that she kept it in a vault in New York City, whatever it was, and that what the Kennedy Library got was just kind of his writings and stuff. This other thing, whatever it was hidden away in a vault. So we're left with some understanding that these groups are aware when this temple rises, when this land rises off the East Coast, that it is Atlantis rising, and it is going to kind of turn the world on its head when it happens, and that whoever gets there first has a tremendous advantage, but also has a tremendous advantage to spin the story one way or the other. So here we are in the middle of the Hotzone, where Cayce was, 1927, trying to get to the bottom of the mystery that he put forward. And with that, Miss Olivia, it's all up to you.
Okay, Silver Fox, do these people all have a common bloodline?
There's bloodlines that are associated, that they obviously are aware of each other, for sure. And I don't know if it's so much that they're similar, but they have an awareness of each other. That's the way that I would put it. But it is significant. There's no question.
Okay.
Yes.
Cursicella, My uncle was married to Lori Firestone, who was a social and political coordinator / senior staffer for George H.W. Bush.
Oh, yeah.
Just putting it out there.
That's great.
Boober Fighter says Godfather Part 2. There's a scene, a boardroom in Cuba. All of the industrialists were represented. We should see that again. Of course, Catherine loves that movie.
That is fantastic. There's two quick little things, since you're talking about bloodlines, that I forgot to put in here. I'm going to mention real quick. And also, one thing I wanted to show, and I might have the other picture here, but basically, you know how we were looking at that sort of Star of David at the top of the Theosophical Society logo? At the top here, this same engineer who tried to design the two-eye stone based on the Cayce readings in the 70s, a NASA engineer, he determined that the top side, since it was a six-sided figure, was the Star of David, just like the Theosophical logo, just like the Dodge logo. Quite interesting. Okay, keep rolling.
48 Tom W. said, to my mind, the Star of David is the Giza Pyramid. Mount Sinai as well is Giza.
Yeah, excellent point.
So there's that Egyptian connection.
Oh, here it is.
Dodges.
I found it real quick. That's it. That's the top. That's the Dodge logo. That's the Theosophical logo. That ties the mystery schools into the Dodges. Now we know why Cayce was pointing them out in relation to Bimini. It's just unquestionable. And that's the same NASA engineer doing this in the 70s, trying to construct the two-eye stone based on Cayce's readings. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay, so I'm going to go by topic. So everyone loves the two-eye stone. Okay?
Yes.
So
let me remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. This is X Series episode 55. And we're going deep into the Hotzone with Edgar Cayce's work. And, this goes into Bimini and goes into the Atlantis Temple Rising. This rising event also relates to the work of Egerton Sykes, who, through his research, found out that Bimini was called Murius in those ancient Celtic Druid legends. So we get an idea here that there's some awareness of how powerful and how important Bimini was then. And we might think of it as kind of like the mountaintop of this great continent. Okay,
so let's start with the two-eye stone.
Yes.
Okay, so Matt M. wanted to know, the stones are in UPenn?
University of Pennsylvania. Well, this is the interesting thing. Of course, even on their website, they say, we don't have them, and we get requests for them all the time. But Cayce had said, this is where, after they take them from Yucatan, this is where they're headed. It's possible they got intercepted. Possible over time they went into a hidden portion. It's possible they were just lost in the museum. But in any case, they don't know. They don't seem to know what he's talking about in relation to these firestones. There's been some research done on this, and it does seem that basically the large two-eye stone is massive, and the portable ones would be smaller. Not small enough to fit in your pocket, but significantly smaller. And we do see in the Yucatan, and I've shown on this program, very unusual carvings of these groups looking at this kind of weird box stone, which has almost like lightning coming out of it. I do believe that the leftover firestones went to Yucatan, in that they actually were recovered according to Cayce. It's undeniable. It's there in the reading. But he said, let me clarify this. A portion of them will be taken to the Pennsylvania State Museum, which they later determined was the university. Okay,
so Zen Ignorance. What kind of crystal was the two-eye stone? Does Cayce have a reading on it? Lapis lazuli?
Oh, Cayce has, let me see. I think over 12 readings on the two-eye stone. And certainly he talks about lapis in relation to the Atlantean temple setups, but he's talking about crystal in relation to the two-eye stone. Sometimes we do hear it called the blue stone, and we can also see the figure that was created by the NASA engineer. It is blue, So it's a blue crystal, which gets us into unusual territory. Yes. Something that's very interesting that Joseph Farrell told me, if I remember this correctly, which is that the granite that is used in the pyramid at its very source is crystal. So again, this crystal is kind of a dominant theme as we go along here. One quick thing I wanted to mention, since somebody asked about bloodlines there, and I didn't have this handy, so I couldn't give them the full answer. There's a couple of quick things I want to mention here. One is that John Francis Dodge, of John and Horace Dodge, the two main brothers, he has a daughter named Isabel Dodge. Now, she marries someone whose name is X Sloan. Actually, the letter X, that's his name. Later, as I'm going through all these records, I see her marriage records to X Sloan, and later I see her divorce X Sloan. And there's all this back and forth with the Sloans and the Dodges. This is a different Dodge Sloan nuptials. I'm going to read you this from 1921. One of the early and ultra-fashionable winter weddings of this season will be that of Miss Jessie Sloan and Mr. William Earl Dodge. It takes place December 18th in New York. Miss Sloan is the daughter of Mr. Henry T. Sloan of the House of W. and J. Sloan, and has been one of the conspicuous figures in New York's most exclusive society since her introduction by her father 3 winters since at a notable dinner dance. Oh, hey, we're going to go to some dinner dances this summer.
Only notable ones.
Mrs. Sloan's aunt is Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. Okay, this is more pretty kick-ass money at the period. These are the major families here at the time. And Mr. and Mrs. William Douglas Sloan will doubtless give shortly some special festivities. So this is a different Sloan Dodge mix, but here X Sloan, who John Dodge's daughter marries. I think this is interesting, and it's odd because he'll sign documents and he will do a number of things under this X moniker, and there's no explanation for it that I've been able to find. There's another daughter that they named Delphina, which I found interesting because the Oracle of Delphi. There's one more thing in here. Let's see what it is. Yes, Isabel. Okay, so she's married to X Sloan. A quick look at Isabel. What happens is that this X Sloan, his real name is George. So now it becomes very unusual why he signs everything, including his marriage certificate, X Sloan. Knowing that we look very closely for X steganography in these, this is a very unusual thing that came up. And she wound up being, an heiress, of course, but a racehorse owner and breeder. So they go into some detail here, saying that her great wealth brought her in contact with America's social elite, and in 1921, she married Manhattan stockbroker George Sloan. So Manhattan stockbroker George Sloan, who called himself X Sloan on all of his legal documents. Very, very unusual. And there's a picture of the Dodge heiress, Isabel, about to marry X Sloan, also known as George Sloan. I think we're getting some there with the Dodges. Interestingly enough, she marries them as soon as her dad and her uncle die. This is kind of strange timing there. But I guess they were happy for 4 years, and quite a fortune coming together there. But I think we're going to see more about the Sloans and the Dodges as we go. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Diane Wald wanted to know, are the stones what they keep in their mysterious purses?
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, I was talking to Graham about the incredible motif of the purse and the kind of man bag, as it's called, that these figures bring from out of the sea when they inform these groups. And they become, this great gateway to all this knowledge. It is quite fascinating. And he reminded me, well, boy, they found a good series of those in America. Now, I'm familiar very much with the Sumerian ones, and I know that they found them, in a number of diverse areas. But the emphasis on America, I think, is quite interesting. And that's why his book, America Before, is interesting to me, to really draw in that Atlantis in America idea. But I will say this, that Magicians of the Gods, which is the book just previous to this one that Graham did, has all that information about this incredible figures of wisdom, these travelers of wisdom who carry these very unusual bags. But yes, they might have the Firestone in there. One thing I want to mention too is that at the end, the daughters gave grants to make these very unusual fountains for the Dodges. Take a look at that one. Certainly it's an unusual figure, and there's something quite advanced about the setup and design. This is what they decided to leave behind of their family. I found it very interesting. Yes, keep rolling.
I just want to say that Scruples4444 said that remote viewing should be utilized as well to find out what the handbags were all about.
Interesting point. Yeah.
It's fantastic. There's a lot of ideas we have for remote viewing projects.
It's great access. Yeah. Well, the thing is, as I've said, when you get into this kind of work and you're doing with exteganography and you're going back, just like with Cayce's work, it's one thing for us to just have read, well, we can read information about these tribes that were back there and try to figure out what Atlantis was all about. Or Cayce can read the Akashic record. I mean, you can line the two up, but you have to have that extra vision going into it. Very often the mystery schools have left the information from what I would call a psychic standpoint, a psychic imprint. And you're not going to be able to read it from a normal level. You're going to have to adjust to the consciousness of the level it was left behind in. So you're going to need somebody on your team who is on that psychic side. And thank God that we have access to that through Gigi's work. And I rely on that heavily.
Okay, I've got a bunch of great questions from Nimza.
Yes.
So did Cayce give readings for people who ended up being high-level Belial and Atlantis, or did the readings only come out for the good guys? I guess what I'm asking is if Cayce ever gave any readings like, hey, you were a bad guy in Atlantis, but you've got another shot. Don't do that again.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're watching the first part of the program, this guy was one of those who originally was part of the Amelius group, using the Two-Eye Stone for spiritual purposes, and then became kind of like a power at any price guy, having been sucked into that Belial machine. So it was happening over and over again. And what's weird is it seems like there's all this regret. It seems like such a pattern that the Belial people were very, very good at taking the Law of One Amelius groups out and converting them over. Interestingly enough, Cayce's own son, Edgar Evans, who was such an expert on Atlantis and was a great guy. I had the occasion to meet him a couple of times. And I mean, this guy at 90 years old looked better than most guys at 60. It was amazing. He obviously was using the Cayce readings. Mm-hmm. And he obviously was an Atlantean, you could tell. Would you say so, Olivia?
No question.
Amazing guy. But it was well known that when Cayce did a reading for him, that Cayce said the Atlantean echo, the memory of those souls of him, was as the dreaded one. And that he had used his incredible powers as an electrical engineer for Belial's purposes, and that he was thought of and looked back at as the dreadful one, the dreaded one, rather. Also, the Two-Eye Stone itself, as Cayce pointed out, was not remembered as the spiritual interface, but by the time of its degeneration and all the rest, the echo from that period, according to Cayce, it was known, and it could be found in documents, as the terrible crystal. So they had remembered its fierce, destructive power and the inundations and the havoc that it caused. So there's no question about it that there's a great mix there in the readings. Yes.
And we still don't have access to his readings, do we?
There's part of Edgar Evans' reading there relating to that wasn't released because it was just a private family reading.
But they still conceal why he was called the dreaded one, yes?
It never came out.
Yeah, there you go.
But certainly, I mean, the idea is pretty implicit. He was one of the engineers.
I don't know. I want details. Oh, it's so horrible.
Yes.
Okay. So Matt M., is there more to Bimini's importance than the location of the two-eye stone? And Brandon Jimenez wanted to know, what do you know about the structural figures that could be seen from the sky by Bimini to Florida, the Nazca lines of the Caribbean?
Oh, very interesting. Those are interesting. And, it's very funny because do I have the book here? I was going to recommend 3 books. And, we have such a great kind of book. We always share books, and I'm putting together kind of the master list for the X series. But there's 3 that I think are crucial for this episode. Certainly, Rudolf Steiner's book, Cosmic Memory, which is actually called Atlantis and Lemuria. This is a powerful book of Steiner's vision of how Atlantis came to be, went to this high civilization, had the advanced technology and the advanced initiates, and then fell to such a degree that there was a process involved. And that process became something that had to be hidden and became this weird Apotheon Effect that these mystery schools hid through extegonography over time, through the Egyptian schools, and through the following mystery schools. Stones of Atlantis, this is interesting, by Dr. David Zink, still holds up. This is a book actually, I'm thinking from the 1980s, and he spent a great deal of time on the Bimini question in the Hotzone, and he found, let's see if I have a picture of it in here, he found in his dives a pillar that would light up the bottom of the ocean over there by Bimini. It's very, very strange. And let's see if I can find this to show you. But basically, how does a pillar that is, it's just standing stone under there, how is it lit? So this is obviously related to that very, very unusual technology. He also did a lot with Bimini as a megalithic site. And so it brings us to the heart of it. I really highly recommend this book, and maybe I will find that. Well, I might post this picture on Twitter at Dark Journalist. But I do find it quite remarkable. Oh, this is it, actually. This column is lit. It's lighting up. It is emitting light. And it's just standing there at the bottom of the ocean by Bimini, radiating all this light for some reason. And so some of his discoveries never been explained, and I think he was one of the best because he was deep, deep in there. Now, are you ready? Hillary Hemingway. This is the daughter of Les Hemingway, who Les Hemingway had founded the new Atlantis there in the Atlantic and was expecting this to rise, and she was deep with her dad on this. Later, she married Jeffrey Lindsay, who he was the writer for Olivia?
Sorry, I wasn't catching you.
Okay, what is the show about the guy who's the serial killer?
I can picture it. I don't know. It's on HBO.
Yeah, it's HBO. And what is the name of that show?
He kills killers.
I
can't think of it.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Jeffrey Lindsay, he's the writer for that. And
Dexter.
Dexter, perfect. That's the show. Way to go, Gigi. Now, Hillary Hemingway is a very, very interesting person for a number of reasons. But she writes a book here called Dream Child, all about a very unusual kind of half-alien child that all these government agencies are after. And the whole thing takes place in basically around the Hotzone. Interestingly enough, there's a character in here named Colonel Andros. And I'll just read you a quick bit of this. Max is not your usual 5-year-old boy, unable to speak, shy and strange. He was conceived while his mother was the victim of an alien abduction. Max is a unique hybrid of human and alien. Now he's undergoing a profound change, physical, mental, emotional, as dark forces prepare to use the boy as a battlefield for warring alien powers that threaten mankind. Because of his parentage, Max is also the only link to understanding between humans and aliens who have landed here. The only one who can tell what the future holds for Earth. He carries the fate of all mankind in his tiny hands. But now that the government has discovered his powerful connection to the aliens, will Max survive long enough to fulfill his purpose for either side? And we have this Colonel Andros in here. Now, the Andros platform not far from Bimini, is another structure like the Bimini Wall underwater. And it's this huge platform, and people like Andrew Collins and Greg and Laura Little have done research on this. The Hemingways always inheritors of information, maybe even information that they don't understand. But again, here we have, this is Mariel's cousin, but the daughter of Les, who went on his expeditions and is there actually in a documentary with him swimming around in the healing well in Bimini in the late 70s. This is an extraordinary person. This book is extraordinary, even as it is a nice little fictional tale. I think it tells us a great deal. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Nimza again. Any connection between the recession/war on the American auto industry and old power struggles from the days of Atlantis?
I think always, when you get into this idea of kind of might makes right, and remember that the Atlanteans enslaved these groups and called them things. Cayce said that they were referred to as untouchables. And they also made their own kind of sort of android beings, for want of a better word. Cayce called them automatons, which was the word for robot back then. So they have this, one of the big problems when they came into Egypt after Atlantis was sunken, was they came with this mass of slaves, and that they had kind of reduced this group just to servitude. So the Belial groups are, that leftover is very dark. On the other hand, it was the Emilius groups who hid the Hall of Records and developed the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx with Rata and Hermes and that whole line. So we can see that real mix there, but we had to apparently live with these Belials even when they were migrating and migrated in. So yes, I would say that their martial philosophy follows them around, and apparently even through lives. Absolutely. Okay, we'll take two more questions, Miss Olivia, and then we'll try to wrap it up as best we can. Fantastic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is fantastic, going deep with you on the Hotzone and Edgar Cayce in the Hotzone, where he was taken by some very unusual businessmen from a strange business front, and who later would disappear with his third version of the readings when they took him into Bimini to do it. I have a feeling there's something about the location of Bimini which was required for Cayce to actually be there, since he could put himself anywhere else in the world. This was an unusual thing that happened, and I think that if we get to the bottom of that, we're going to understand a lot more about Bimini. Certainly we've brought in the Dodge family tonight and the Hemingways and Henry Firestone, and of course, this millionaires group having Firestone in it, along with Ford and Edison, gets our curiosity going, because again, Firestone is literally the name that Cayce gave to the Atlantean, the portable version of the Two-Eye Stone. I don't think there's any accident there. It seems like some of these names are imprints. They're not so much just coincidence. But I'm open to more ideas on that. By the way, everyone, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, keep us in touch. We've been seeing everyone get thrown off.
I hate to say it, it's only a matter of time.
Let's get real. It's inevitable. And there will always be platforms, and we will always adopt. But with your great support, it makes it easier. And certainly if you're signed up for the newsletter, it is really the pipeline between us. And we know, Olivia and I, when we're doing this, that when we get the newsletter out, we know that that information is getting to you. You're not getting blocked off of YouTube, or they're blocking you through Facebook or whatever. That's a good feeling. And so make sure you're at least on there, and go ahead and subscribe to the site while you're there. We've made it incredibly affordable. Literally $5 a month. I mean, I couldn't do any better than that. And trust me that for the second half of 2019, you're going to want to be a member. And I'm not going to say much more than that. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Madam. Did Steiner believe Jupiter would be the new Earth because Earth was going to be destroyed?
Well, developed, yes. The thing is that we have to understand that it's a new Jupiter which becomes new Earth. And it is interesting because Steiner takes the idea of the eighth sphere, which Ahriman has set up, these dark astral forces, and it's an artificial step. But what's actually supposed to happen is we're supposed to develop the kind of spiritual consciousness that creates an ethereal body for the earth. And in Steiner's setup, that gets us to what he calls the warmth of Vulcan. And it is that Vulcan sphere, which is still in the ethereal now, that gets developed and leads to New Jupiter. And that is basically, when you're talking about in Christian terminology, that's the New Jerusalem. That's when you reach that spiritual place in consciousness. And we can think of that all as a physical process, like, hey, we'll go there and we'll do all this. Probably a great deal of it just takes place in our consciousness, literally. But we have to play it out in order to see how it works. So, by the way, Steiner also talked about those who were getting locked into the eighth sphere as being kind of harvested by these forces, Ahrimanic forces and Luciferian forces, two very separate things. But he talks about this thing which is a bitter moon. When we get into the cosmos, I think it's quite unusual because just as Steiner had this vision about this new Jupiter, when Cayce would engage psychically with the planets, for example, he saw Saturn and those rings in one of his visions as kind of like a maximum security prison. So that's interesting. It's where all insufficient matter is cast for remolding, basically. So we have to understand these planets have a physical side, and then there's a kind of a metaphysical extension. And if we understand spiritual science, or if we understand the Cayce readings, we're going to understand these things in the full kind of holistic picture, as opposed to just thinking about them as cool places to visit. Okay, we'll take two more questions, Miss Lee.
Okay, so these are both linked. Before we do that, I just wanted to say, this was from earlier tonight. Medley Childress said, my cat Thor is listening intently and watching the screen. And that we hear that a lot.
Are you related to David Hatcher Childress would be my next question. I forgot to mention that, right? Contact in the Desert is happening too. Right?
Yes.
So let's see, Contact in the Desert, Bilderberg, and the Unidentified program all in the same weekend. Jeez, that's pretty good.
Okay.
It's kind of precious. I'd rather be here.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Keeping it real. All right. Carol Casa says, what would define that superior Atlantean spiritual development? And David Donaway says, do planetary civilizations channel, quote, higher civilizations to evolve?
That's the point. That's really the point. Well, let's think about the process that Cayce discusses in relation to the two-eye stone. The two-eye stone is set up only by initiates at the time. The priestesses are selected that are the most spiritually advanced, but they train them too to become spiritually advanced. And they engage in a process of purification whereby they can interact with this stone. Now, it's quite fascinating because when speaking with Graham Hancock last weekend, he was talking about how a landmass, for example, will inform a culture, or how in Stonehenge, as opposed to some wise group knowing where to put Stonehenge, it actually was the stones themselves and the way that they were positioned to, perfect north, or to be able to tell the seasonal changes that were instructing humanity on what to do. So we get into this interaction where the technology, the stones themselves communicated. And so what Cayce refers to as these priestesses interacting with higher beings from the outer spheres. So these are higher spiritual beings that they have direct access to. They're not just getting inspirations. They're not, they're having, in effect, face-to-face meetings with, because of the ability to do this. This is actually what the two-eye stone was for, according to Cayce. And it did have its physical uses, but then the physical uses got misused and brought destructive forces, and then later got used for war. So they already have problems even before they're going to war with this thing by using it, applying it. It's too materially based. But when we think about the forces that were being contacted by the Atlanteans in this period, it's probably that direct interaction on the spiritual side. So these are very high forces that are trying to advance humanity into that spiritual evolution and growth. And then side by side with it, you have the Belial groups that are all under Ahrimanic control. And when we look around now, I'm afraid that in the second decade of the 21st century, we've arrived right into the age of Ahriman. I mean, we are here in the middle of it. And so how are you going to, how you're going to counteract that is what's left that the mystery schools have given us as a legacy that's just there. And they haven't said, hey, you have to do it or else. They've said, we've left it here for you. You can do this. And so it's up to us to choose it, to discover what they've left behind for us. It seems to me they left the X-steganography behind, 1. 2, they've left the 100-year curve from 1916 to so 2016, and then they counted 3 decades, 2 to 3 decades. So there's a window that goes from now to basically 2046. That's the window in which anthroposophy and theosophy could be fulfilled. The spiritual science. So this is what we're looking at, in essence. They've left us the information. They've left us that Ahriman is coming in through the technology. They've left us the information about the 8th sphere. And they're working all the time. But they're not going to just come out, in my opinion, these groups, and say, here, they come forward, they bring forward information, they see how we work with it, and they keep an eye on things, and they lead the culture, they leak things out into the culture to help us battle against these things. Because, as Steiner describes it, just like in 1840, when the scientific materialism was coming in as a flood, that was the point at which they had to give up so many of their secrets in order to help counterbalance that. And interestingly enough, there's a side note here, which is that the churches looked at this, and even though the churches were against that kind of mystery teaching or had even persecuted it, they also wanted help against the scientific materialism, the way it was coming down. So a lot of things go on behind the scenes. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Michael Cook asked a great question. He said, Joseph Farrell referenced an experiment that showed human intention affects material properties.
Sure.
Could the 2-eye stone be an amplifier for this effect and not a power source on its own?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this gets us into that whole X technology idea too, because the thing that the UFO technology has in common with this whole Atlantean question, it seems to me, is that it's run on consciousness, and that you have to be aware enough to be able to fly something like that, to utilize that technology. This comes in with the X technology too, you see, because it's not, when we get into the UFO file and the X technology, the sum of it is not that some alien spaceship crashed and now we have this incredible technology that we can use. It's more than that. I'm sure there are aspects like that. There's no question about it. But the X technology seems to rely on something else. So, for example, in John Keely's work, both Steiner and Blavatsky referred to it basically as psychic mentation technology. And so that is pure mental into physical, coming from a spiritual place. And that technology, which was about to be grabbed by corporate forces, apparently the Theosophical Society had the good wits to hide Keely's technology. So it's quite remarkable. Yes, Miss Olivia, we'll take one more.
I love this question. Giovanni Delgado, should we watch Unidentified?
Well, I watched it and I was bored.
Yeah, I think for anybody who knows the subject, we're going to be bored to death. The only,
it was kind of
don't
like,
waste your time. Do some good research.
I'll give you the 30-second version of it. Oh my God.
Boom, right? The sound effects.
And then, they set up these Navy pilots and talked to them about the sightings that they had, right? Okay, that's good. I mean, we've had lots of Navy pilots go on the record before and commercial pilots. It's always nice to have people describe their experiences. But over and over again, the implication seems to be that almost caused an incident. They were threatening our skies. Threat, threat, threat. Actually, I think you could define TTSA if you just sat down and wrote the word threat 100 times. You pretty much have TTSA. That's all that they want to communicate. And whenever you see, DeLong or Elizondo out there for interviews, or they're putting this big Bushy out there now, Bush guy, W. Bush guy, Chris Mellon, nonstop. This guy has links to both the Clintons and the Bushes, and he worked for both in intelligence, okay? It's a pretty unsavory figure. But Mellon is out there going, this is a national security question. Basically, I want money for defense to shoot at these ships. And for all we know, they're going to make holograms of those ships in order to generate money for this. But your question is, should we watch it? Yeah, I mean, I think when they're working on these things, for me as a journalist, I want to know what they're up to. And I also want to see if there's any substance in the things that they're putting forward. My own impression, and I'm sure, people could look at the show different ways, but it seemed extremely unimpressive to me. Well, that is, I think we've had good testimony from pilots before. Like I said, in the 90s, you had Oprah doing shows with alien abductees. So, what's new here? It's not. What is new is the CIA coming out openly and saying, we want to take this over. And by the way, the UFO issue is now UAP, and it just started in 2017. And anyone who says anything else is not going to be included in the party. But if anybody goes along with us, you get on the party train. It doesn't work that way. And the CIA is going to get booted out of this. I don't think that show is going to do very well. That's my impression. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Yeah. Walter just joined the
chat. Walter, you're at CITD. How's it going down there? Did you get into a scuffle with?
No gossip yet.
No gossip.
We are waiting.
That's good. That's good. Actually, stay out of trouble. I'll tell you, there's some great people now at Contact in the Desert. I know that I hear great updates and great reports from people. And that's the problem with Contact in the Desert, which is it became the haven for the cult stuff, became the haven for the, the Wilcock, oh, look, I'm a whistleblower, that whole thing. And cabal arrests are coming, and the weird fear porn that came out. And unfortunately, Contact benefited from that. But they have a chance to make that a real, event, because you still have good people like Eric von Daniken who come there, or Linda Moulton Howe, our great friend Linda here. So, you have the ability to make that fantastic, and to not have it be like, Emery Smith fought 3,000 aliens and, was held in a torture chamber. I mean,
this is the problem between research and entertainment.
Yes, absolutely.
Research, frankly can be boring, and tedious. It's not great for a show.
Well, it depends. I mean, it always depends, but I know what you mean. Sometimes just somebody telling a story can generate excitement.
Well, it can be a little academic.
I don't even, this is the weird thing. It's not even that I mind stories. What I mind is insidious plagiarism wrapped in with somebody's story to become like a vacuum cleaner for money and energy in the space. That we've already seen when the cults rolled in, and we've already, gone on record with our programs. Those cults will do anything from docs to scams and all the rest of it. And, the Blue Chicken cult, we saw a ton of that with them. And so that type of thing, I think that the scene is growing up, and that stuff within a very short period of time is going to look pathetic. Somebody saying, oh, I just went to Mars and boy, my arm's tired. That whole thing, I think we've outgrown it, and we're moving into something else. But what's happening is, as we point out on this program a lot, we get the intel forces on one side. So TTSA is an intel op mixed with a money op. And so the marketing op and then the intel op, and they're meant to squeeze the narrative in the middle. And you do have a lot of good people caught squeezed in the middle. And unfortunately, you also have some of the people who are really quite important ones in this work, like George Knapp, for example, who, I admired his work, laying out this red carpet for the CIA and Elizondo and all this TTSA junk. And I won't do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to happen. And I've communicated that to them. It's never going to happen. So we're going to get the real thing. And if we're not going to get the real thing and you're going to try to jam this down our throat, then we're going to expose you.
Mm-hmm.
Simple. Like good journalism. Look, good journalism, investigative journalism, is adversarial journalism. Make no mistake about it. And it's getting to the root of the matter for the purpose of people having the truth about it. So therefore, things like the CIA hijacking the UFO file is not something a good journalist is going to go along with. And I'm sorry that we're seeing good journalists go along with it for the gravy train or the whatever things they're promised, but it's never going to happen here. Okay.
Yeah, and if suddenly your friends and relatives are curious about UFOs like they never have been before because of the New York Times article and whatnot, show them a great documentary like Out of the Blue or I Know What I Saw.
Oh, absolutely.
The citizens' hearing on disclosure.
Definitely.
Fantastic.
Well, you made a good point, which is a lot of the problem here is that they have done a psychological profile on the public who believes in UFOs. And that public does what, Miss Olivia?
I don't know. What do we do? They
go and they say, they can't wait to say, I was right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they go to go ahead, you've told me this.
Yeah, well, you want validation.
Yes.
I always give the example of, Uncle Louie at Thanksgiving will razz you year after year after year about the UFOs. And you just want so badly to be validated by Uncle Louie. And it's pretty cheap, it's like, the truth. Why do you care what Uncle Louie thinks? That now he, or for me, my clients now, they're sending me articles and they, I've been talking to them about UFOs for years. I don't need their validation. I know what I know.
Exactly.
I don't gain anything. Actually, it's kind of a chore now to have to explain things to them.
Well, I think the problem is the question is going to be, since they're feeding them a false CIA version of disclosure, is their state going to be worse once they buy into this phony version than it was before they even bought into the UFO question? Mm-hmm. Quite interesting, I think, as far as it goes. Wow. A fantastic show tonight, everyone. Thank you so much for bringing your questions. Please go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. We have exciting things coming up for you. And I did want to mention, since you brought up Catherine Austin Fitts, that she has intimated to me on a number of occasions, and even publicly, that a lot of this is of the TTSA and this hijacking of the UFO file is to, take something like the 21 missing trillions from the government and just say, oh, don't worry about it. We were working on saving you from aliens. So, we definitely have a brain trust here on this side of the fence that is looking at things for real. And like I said, it's important to support things like the Dark Journalist Show, like the work that Catherine does with Solari, like Giza Death Star. These are important outlets and can send a mighty ripple across these kind of waves of disinformation that we're seeing. I want to wrap up this program with a little bit of a Cayce reading to round out the whole Cayce part, because after all, Cayce went through tremendous sacrifice and suffering in his life in order to bring us the information from the mystery schools, from that psychic space about Atlantis and our true history and our true heritage back there. And there's so many good quotes to choose from, but I just want to get a little something in there about the Firestone. And so here, off we go. About the Firestone that was in the experience, did the activities of the entity then make those applications that dealt with both the constructive and destructive forces in the period? Constructive and destructive forces were generated by the activity of this stone. in the center of a building that today would be said to have been lined with non-conductive metals, non-conductive stone, something akin to asbestos. The building above the two-eye stone was oval, or a dome, wherein there could be or was the rolling back, so that the activity of the stone was received from the sun's rays or from the stars. I always found that interesting. The concentrating of the energies that emanate from bodies that are on fire themselves with the elements, these recently rediscovered gases, those of the electrical and areatic formations, and the breaking up of the atomic forces to produce impelling force to those means and modes of transportation, travel, lifting large, heavy weights, or changing the faces and changing the forces of nature itself. This is how powerful the two-eye stone was, and I think that's important for us to keep in mind whenever we get into this and understand what's happening with the Hotzone, which is whatever took place there and whatever it is they're trying to get knowledge about in relation to that area between Cuba and Bimini. It has huge ramifications in terms of not only our physical world, but it seems to be some kind of interface between the spiritual and the physical world. And so the technological aspect, I think, is gigantic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was a fantastic show to have you here. And I had a great time going deep into the Hotzone with you. We'll be back next week at 8 o'clock on Friday. And coming up also is the video from our great live conference with Graham Hancock. Just amazing material coming out with that. If you're a subscriber, of course, you get that information first. Subscribe to Dark Journalist at darkjournalist.com and make sure that we stay in touch with each other. We have a great June coming up for you. And thank you very much. I want to do a few shout outs. Gigi Young, of course, excellent work. And thank you, Gigi. Najat, great. And you're doing great on Twitter too, Najat. And just throwing out some very, very interesting things. Also, I see Jacqueline Diamond. Excellent. Great to see you out there. Gaia Sophia, of course. And Lee Veltman, he's out there. Nimza, fantastic. Thank you for tipping me off about Godzilla and the Fenway Park meltdown. That certainly is great stuff. Anyone else? Oh, Joseph, is great to see you out there, of course, and Walter Bosley. His new book is Esoteric Napoleon. We're going to get him on for that. And also we're going to get Joseph back. Joseph's book right now, McCarthy, Monmouth, and the Deep State, opening up this very fascinating period relating to the UFO file right there. And I think that there's so much to be found in that period because we know that the Kennedys are so deep in the warp and woof of the story. I
want to give a few shout outs to some super chatters.
Yes.
Okay, so Bill Gometz, Eric Ackerley, Rosterman the Seer, and B. Brax. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Supporting the show is always incredibly helpful. And we will see you next week. And the last question, Miss Olivia, what are you in the mood for?
I think it's going to be the pickled jalapeno quesadilla again. I know.
Well, it's not bad. It's not bad.
No, I love it. It's my treat.
I think it has to be. I'm thinking, what about to drink?
Lemonade and tequila.
Lemonade and tequila. All right, maybe a turkey burger. It could be. It could be a turkey burger kind of a night.
With sweet potato French fries.
Unbelievable. I don't know about that. They sound incredible.
They're healthier anyway.
Now you're talking. Did you say without jalapenos?
What do you know? With that's the priority is to get the jalapenos.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure it was actually Olivia because I know you love jalapenos.
The quesadilla is a carrier for the pickled jalapenos. It's a medium.
We will see you all next week, everyone. Thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Good night.
So it's basically just a vehicle for the jalapenos.
Yes, it is. It's a vehicle for the jalapenos. You got it.
Makes sense.